the energy and excitement. Start of another council meeting day. I should get started. I'd like to officially welcome everyone to the work session of the Provo Municipal Council for Tuesday, November 12th, 2019. It is a few minutes past 1:30 and we are gathered in the City Center Conference Room at 351 West Center Street, Provo, Utah. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. Please be aware that the microphones in the room pick up the noise of paper and other rustling objects, and that these microphones can pick up side conversations. We will begin with a roll call. Mr. Parker, would you lead us?
Yes, Wayne Parker.
Mayor Kafusi.
Gary Winterton.
George Stewart.
Hannah Salzman.
Chris Becker. Dave Harding.
Elizabeth Van Dorten.
Dave Sewell.
George Hanley.
Dave Peck.
Ryan Jones.
Excellent. And our opening prayer will be provided by Mr. David Rogers.
Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the opportunity we have to meet today to discuss the needs of Provo City. We pray that Thou will guide the decisions made and those that are presenting, that they can present to the best of their abilities, and that we can all have clear minds and that we can do what's in the best needs of the people. We thank Thee for the opportunity to be here, and we ask for this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Mr. Rogers. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those seated at the council table may speak or ask questions unless otherwise directed by the chair. And speaking of decorum, we'd like to begin by acknowledging a couple of birthdays. Mr. George Stewart and Mr. Wayne Parker are celebrating their birthdays today.
George and I were born in the same year. At least I feel that way.
We're recognizing them today for their birthdays this week.
Are coming.
And I guess now might be a good time to acknowledge the passing of Mr. Mumford.
The movie?
Oh, I was like,
Passing on to another county. Well, some of us are very sad and in mourning because of his departure, his career departure.
His dad was born in.
Yeah. That. So we will just sing the regular version of Happy Birthday. So I guess just start off.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, George and Wayne. Happy birthday to you.
It's not the same. It's just not the same. All right.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, please.
I will advise that we will be having, I think, what might be George's favorite treat, root beer floats during the break, dinner break.
Excellent. All right. Celebrate even more then. All right. Item number 1 on the council business is a discussion regarding voter participation areas. This discussion will be led by our council attorney, Mr. Brian Jones, and is budgeted for 10 minutes.
Hopefully it shouldn't take anywhere near that long. But as many of you may be aware, in the last legislative session, House Bill 119 revamped some of the state procedures regarding initiatives and referenda. As you know, in order to put an initiative or a referendum on the ballot, it requires the sponsors to gather a certain number of signatures. One of the changes that was made in HB 119 was to require that those signatures be obtained across a cross-section of the city, and to make sure that it is not a neighborhood-specific item. Therefore, it's mandated that every city create voter participation areas, and when a sponsor for an initiative or a referendum goes to collect signatures, they have to meet a threshold, not only citywide, but a threshold in at least 75% of the voter participation areas. Now, by default, the state law mandates that each city create 8 voter participation areas that are compact, contiguous, and a substantially equal population. You're familiar with those phrases from last time we did redistricting. and that those be in place by January 1st of 2020, and then be revamped in 2022 and again every 10 years. However, in cities that have council districts, they may use the council districts rather than creating separate areas. So I believe it's the recommendation and intention of our election officer, our city recorder, to just move forward with using, for the foreseeable future, the council districts. But we wanted to make you aware of this and indicate to you that if the council desires to go with 8 voter participation areas instead of using the districts, they have the right to do that, but you have to act before January 1st or before January 1st of 2022. And that's really all we wanted to present, just so you were aware of the issue in case any action was desired. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Tell me about the 75% number again. What is it?
So if you have, so let's say you have 8 districts, which is the default, right? You have to, there's a citywide threshold, I can't remember what the number is, but there's also a threshold that you have to meet in the districts, and you have to meet that threshold in 75% of the areas. So if you had 8 areas, you would have to meet the threshold in at least 6 of them. For Provo City, if
it's not within that district itself, you have to have 75%.
That's not 75% of the signatures.
Yeah.
That's how many of the areas you have to meet the signature limit in. So let's say the signature limit is, I'm making up a number, but let's say it's 5,000 signatures. In Provo, you would have to get 5,000 signatures in 4 of the 5 council districts, in addition to getting 25,000 signatures citywide. And again, I'm making up the numbers about the signatures,
yeah.
but that's an example.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Why do we even have to do that? If it takes 75% for it to vote, for it to pass, there's no really need for a vote, but that makes sense.
Now, the idea is that there have been cities in the past where, let's say you've got a city of a population of 100,000 and you need 20,000 signatures to get on the ballot, and they got 20,000 signatures in a fourth of the city, right? And the legislature decided that wasn't what they wanted to do. So
I appreciate that, actually.
So is there anyone on the council who has concerns about just moving forward with the 5 council districts? Is there any desire to? I don't see any. And likewise, I have no desire to create new districts when we already have districts. My only thought was, if 8 is kind of the default, 5 is quite a bit less than the 8. We happen to also have 7 contiguous, compact, and roughly equivalent districts that the school board uses, but I imagine that isn't one of the options. Or is that one of the options?
no, under the way the law is currently written, you would have to use, you'd either have to create 8 or use the currently existing districts. Now, let's say when the next census comes out, going into 2022, when we're doing redistricting anyway, let's say, for example, if the council wanted to get rid of the at-large districts and create 7 districts at that time, they could then use those 7 as the voter participation areas.
Any other comments on this? Thoughts? Okay, do we need a motion, or are we comfortable that the administrative default is what we support?
I mean, it's information only unless you're choosing to do something else. So.
Let's move on to item number 2 then. A discussion regarding an amendment to the City Code regarding the disposal of certain confiscated guns and a resolution authorizing the police department to apply the proceeds of those sales to public interest use. This will be presented by Lieutenant Joseph Ott.
Audie.
Sorry, I should have
It's a-
prepped you on that.
It's a
before.
common thing. So,
Thank you, Provo City Police.
thanks for having me here. What you guys will be voting on tonight is it's an updating current policy that we have. What's happened is the state law has been updated, numbers, verbiage, things like that. But the law itself won't change anything that we do here. We receive guns at the police department through investigations, seizures, lost property. And once we take those guns in, we hold them for the appropriate amount of time, and then when the time comes to dispose of them, we can sometimes give them back to the people we took them from. Sometimes we cannot. If they're unsafe, we can dispose of them. If we can't find an owner, and we do searches and things like that, see if we determine an owner. At that point, if they're unsafe, we dispose them, destroy them, or we can sell them. When we sell them, the proceeds go back into our training budget, and that's how we dispose of our firearms. So, like I said, with the new law, some smaller things have changed, but the overall, the meaning of the law, whatnot, remains the same, and it won't change our policies. It's just to update with the new law verbiage. And Brian, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's accurate. We're just making a change to city code that reflects changes made to state law. One of the things that's in there is that one of the sections that city code currently refers to has been repealed, so we're deleting the reference to it.
Does anybody have any questions on that, sir?
So I've gone to your bike sales before, but I've never heard this advertised. When and where do you actually sell these?
So I'll defer to Doris on.
We actually have a limited number of resources that we can take our firearms to. They have to be a state bid facility, so we take them to wholesale guns up in Salt Lake City.
Any other questions?
Just a point of clarification, I was looking through these flow charts, which are very helpful. I just noticed the verbiage is, if they're unsafe, they must be destroyed. And then, if they are safe, I believe the verbiage was can sell. And so, like you must destroy them if they're unsafe, but if they're safe, then they can be sold.
Correct.
If they're not sold, what else could they be?
So some departments just have a blanket policy, they destroy all firearms. If they can't release them to somebody, they just destroy them.
Okay.
And so that's where that would apply, but we sell ours and use the proceeds.
Okay. And then a particularly astute reporter asked me how many guns are currently in the police department possession right now that fall under this.
I'd say roughly 400.
Wow. And so how often do we make that run up to Salt Lake to sell to?
We've made one run, I think, in 2018. We have not been back this year. We're just waiting for an update.
Okay. So we're talking on, close to a gun per day is coming into the possession of the police department.
Maybe on average, but we have guns dating back to 2002. I mean, if there's a warrant on the case, we have to hold the gun. Even after we go through finding out if the owner of the gun can possess a firearm due to a background check, we still have to petition to either the city attorney or the county attorney to return ownership of the gun to the police department in order for us to proceed with the next step to either dispose or sell the firearm. So it's a lengthy process to, be able to get rid of a gun.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Lottie. Still probably. Thank you, appreciate it. Item 3 is a discussion regarding affordable housing policy. This will be presented by Chris Strachan, our Executive Director, and is budgeted for 30 minutes.
All right. Let's hope that I can keep ahead of the calendar, the clock like everyone else has so far. Hannah, can you bring up the PowerPoint? So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of this report that staff wrote.
I don't have PowerPoint.
It's in the, I emailed it to you, but it's also in the issue file.
Sorry, it isn't in my email, so I'm going to the issue file now, so.
Sure. 21. All right. So the subject matter is affordable housing, and I want to just give you a brief overview of what the Housing Committee has worked on in recent times. You may have to move it manually. Okay. So some of the things that the Housing Committee has accomplished over the recent 2-year period is to revise the downtown parking ratio, update the A&S overlay zones. We've commenced work on a housing audit, and we've done a bunch of work looking at a community land trust, and then the Provo City Housing Authority created their own. And then one of the things that we had some outstanding accounts with the neighbor works that needed to be revised and worked out, and those have been resolved. There's other work going on. One of the things that we talked about too is, are there some housing programs that can be done at the city level to help promote recruitment of public safety officers, for example, like a Good Neighbors program. Those can be implemented by the city if the administration chooses to do so. But we wanted to look at inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing policies. These require developers of new market rate real estate to provide affordable units as well. An economically diverse community can benefit low-income households. They can also enhance the lives of neighbors in market rate housing as well. One of the things that underlies a lot of our thinking in this is we already know that Provo has close to 60% of all the affordable housing units in the county, and roughly 60% of our overall units are rental, largely because of the student population, but also all sectors of our population are using rental housing to a great degree. Some pros and cons about affordable housing. One of the biggest things that sets inclusionary zoning apart from other strategies is it encourages the developer to build the affordable units on site with market rates and result in a greater mix of housing types. It's seen as a good thing for building, promoting the growth of families within your populations. But the con is the burdens of inclusionary zoning are passed on to housing consumers, housing producers, and landowners. And the flip side of that is, to whatever degree, if it's not passed on to the consumers, say if you have a 100-unit facility and you make 10 of them affordable, if the developer can't pass those costs on to the other units within within the development, then the developer eats those costs.
So some offer like density bonuses to make it up.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the way. That's one way you make it up. But these are just two things that come out when you talk about the pros and cons of the zoning. So as we look through different documents and studies out there, we identified a number of things that you should think about: the applicability threshold, the tenure, set aside, affordability levels, incentives, and are there other ways to achieve it. So an applicability threshold is how many units can be built. And basically the rule is the more units a developer builds, the easier it is for the developer to absorb costs. And along with that, of course, is passing the costs on. So these are just some of the cities, they tend to be major cities that have them, but these are some of the thresholds that they have that they're required to have affordable housing units when they get past these numbers of units in a development. Tenure, the conditions under which land or buildings are held or occupied, really comes down to for sale or rental. And we had a lot of discussion on this idea that since we have so much rental in the city already, should we be focusing on home ownership programs? And then you can see that some of the big cities, again, they have most have both, some have for sale only. Set aside what percentage of homes should be included in the policy. And the key is to balance the needs of the community with the interests of the developers. Again, you can see some of the percentages. All this stuff comes straight from that report that I passed out
Cliff, I have a question, and it goes back to a couple of slides back, but when you say 10 unit, number of units that they were required to do that, are those based on building permits, or are they based on, so if we have a developer that comes in and says, I've got all these lots that I want to sell?
I'd have to go back to the source material, but I think that generally it's a project size, number of units.
The number of units, potential number of
Potential
units,
number of
whether
units.
they're built on at that time or not, whether they're
Yeah,
for sale.
and these may actually be, I think it's very possible, not having gone right down into the level, because this came from another chart that we stole this chart from somewhere, another report. But it's possible you go in that these might only be multifamilies. It just depends on what the policy of the cities are.
So if they're doing lots, they just have to designate a certain number of lots.
I would think so.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the percentage. Affordability level, what income level should qualify for affordable units? Place in affordability below 80% limits housing options, and you'll see that some of these cities have done different programs that get past the 100% of AMI. And really what you want to do is, as we read through this stuff, is to set a level that provides options for the various incomes. And I think one of the keys to doing that is to tier your program somehow, if you go the route of inclusionary zoning. Incentives. Are there incentives that could be used to help the developer? Yes, there are. Sometimes you may decide to allow them to build their affordable units elsewhere. So let's say you're building a neighborhood of $500,000, $1 million homes. It might not make sense to put an affordable unit in there. Maybe you allow them to have the credits to use at some other location in the city. Land dedications. Maybe you get the value of some land somewhere in the city, so you can work with your nonprofit partners to put together a project. Can you dedicate existing units that meet requirements? And when I read through this part, the part about certain requirements is certain standards. You don't want to just dump all the oldest housing stock in the city into affordable units under this program. One we talked about quite a bit was this idea of fee in lieu. Maybe you don't want, maybe you have an area of the city where you have a lot of affordable units and you don't necessarily want units there. So maybe you don't charge as much there, or maybe you charge more depending on what you want to do, so that you can try and take funds from, rather than building a project, take funds from that and put it into another area of the city. And then impact fee waivers, and maybe you reduce impact fees for projects to meet certain kinds of standards. And when we talked about it in the housing committee, the idea was maybe you provide for housing under a certain AMI for ownership, and you use those maybe within the context of, say, a community land trust, and maybe you provide a waiver on your impact fees for those projects, with the idea that those become affordable for sale homes to allow people who are under 80% AMI to build some equity along the way. So here's some incentives used elsewhere. Denver offers $5,500 per unit to help offset the cost. Cambridge does density bonusing. San Diego does fee waivers. Some more, the fee in lieu. Denver seems to have a pretty high one, 50% of affordable sales price. I think the one that came up in one of our discussions was this gap between the affordable sales price and the cost to construct. And then the different models again. This is just really a question we put to you: is the council willing to consider alternative measures which developers could utilize to satisfy their contribution to affordable housing other than built units? In other words, there's something that we haven't thought of yet. These are some questions from the sake of a policy that you would want to consider. Who's eligible for affordable housing under a program the city could come up with? What kinds of developments should it apply to? What kind of incentives would you offer? What measures would you use to see if it's actually doing what we want it to? And then one of the questions is, how do you require? And it seems that there are some ordinances out there in the state of Utah, but I talked to, I actually got a voicemail from the ULCT, and Meg Ryan there told me that that there's some mixed thought on whether or not you can do it by ordinance or whether you have to do it by development agreements. And it's her opinion that you actually have to create a program that allows it by development agreements. In other words, it has to be proffered. So I'm still trying to do some work and background work on that to find out what the real issue is there.
So how do they do it in Park City?
Park City has an ordinance, so that's why I have the question, because they have an ordinance. In fact, I in the report there will note for you that Park City has one, and they require 20% workforce housing with each new commercial development. And you know, they had the problem for decades where they had all these ski resorts and other places, and they had this great commute every day in and out of Park City for the people that actually work there because they can't afford to live there. So that's a problem they had. Murray City has a policy, and they base it on a density bonus system where they offer 1, 2, and 3 unit per acre density bonuses. And as part of that bonus, the affordable housing element requires 20% of the units to be dedicated to those who earn between 80 and 60% AMI. So there, you can come up with a policy or program that fits our needs. And that's really the outline of the presentation. Really what I wanted to do from this point is allow you the opportunity or have you talk about these ideas and give some direction to the Housing Committee of, one, whether you even want to continue looking at it, and if so, where do you want to focus it? And we recognize that in 2 months there'll be a new council on, the work will, you know, be revisited and things, but at the same time, kind of get your feelings on a program. Are there any questions for me, George?
Yeah, I can't remember if we had gotten to the data point on 60% affordable housing in Provo, but how much of that is student housing? How much of that is actually serving people who are not students, families?
I don't know the answer to that,
we still don't know.
but those are data points we'd have to explore.
Yeah.
My memory, and we would probably do best to get Robert Vernon in here, but I believe he does not look at student housing. He looks just at the vouchers and the subsidies and the type of housing that he specializes in, and that kind of housing, we do have a majority of everything in the county, and there's various reasons for that. You know, proximity to resources that help these people that need help, and of course that's kind of bounces back to inclusionary zoning. If you kind of spread out the people that in theory need help with those who are able to help them, then you have a better community. But yeah, we struggle for a variety of reasons. It's not just because of student housing.
Just a couple quick comments. First of all, I agree. I have a hard time when we use Park City as an example, for I think they're so different than what we are. I mean, their reason for doing what they're doing is such a different reason for what we have here. So I don't like to just keep bringing Park City up, unless it's just an example for a
Yeah, the example is workforce housing, and if our own teachers and police and firefighters in Provo, with what they're making, cannot afford to live in Provo.
But their extreme is much more extreme. I mean, the difference is...
It is more extreme, but...
So I think you just need to be careful on that. The second of all, I think when you start doing inclusionary housing and zoning and stuff, we have to be, again, I think you just have to be careful, because for a developer to subsidize inclusionary housing, somebody has to pay for that. And so what happens is that the medium income people that are buying the houses, all their houses now go higher. And so it becomes an income distribution program. And I think we just have to be careful and recognize that as we do it.
Well, if you give him a bonus to make up for the fact that he is putting...
Yeah, but how can you give him a bonus? How's somebody paying for that bonus?
The density bonus? We control the densities, and if we have a cap on density and say, we'll raise the cap if you do this, then we're giving him something that wasn't there before.
But you've got to have that property to be able to do that. I mean, it's.
Okay, Marty?
So I appreciate Mr. Van comments on this. I think these are some of the questions that we've been grappling with as a housing committee, and I absolutely agree. We have to be very careful because this is we're talking about a lot of money. Even a small program affects a lot of people and affects a lot of the economics of this. So I think we need to be very careful. I think we need to be very clear on what our goals are. I do like the Park City example because it is extreme and it's easy to see. It's easy to see. It's easy to look at that and understand why the people working in the hotels, the people that are working on the slopes and whatnot are not able to afford to live in that community. I absolutely agree that Provo is not in the same tier as Park City when it comes to that. But I do feel like we are starting to feel some of those housing pricing pressures and some people who would like to live at work in Provo, that maybe go to school in Provo or whatever, that can't afford to live in the community. And so to me, that's the ultimate goal, is to make sure that our housing stock covers a cross-section of our community, and so we don't have groups of people that participate in Provo that can't afford to live here. Now, we're going to have some people that work in Provo that choose to live outside of Provo. We're going to have people that live in Provo that choose to work outside of Provo. But if there's a wholesale group, a daily migration, that's why I think we need to be careful that our store clerks and the people that we depend on, that the community depends on, and are served by, have a place in Provo. If I can touch on a couple other things. One thing about the economic, first about the density, the way that value is created that can then be used to compensate only occurs if, one, we are holding densities lower than what we think is optimal, and then moving them up to what we think is optimal and giving that added value to the developer. Or we're setting our density limits to where we think that they're optimal, and then we're allowing density above what we think is optimal for that area and using that. So I agree that there's nothing free. If you give something away, that comes from something, but where I think that's coming from is what the optimal density should be, and we're either fudging it one way or the other. In thinking this through, I'm not a macroeconomist. There we go, economist. But I think if you add this in, it does make it more expensive. But the market, I think, keeps prices where from going up. Other than some people will pay a premium to live in Provo because it's close to where they want to be or whatever, but that premium is already there. So if we increase the cost, really that price can't go up to compensate for it. But also a builder, likely, they can build in multiple locations, so that increase in cost may make them feel like, well, I'm not going to build in Provo, I'm going to build somewhere else because it's too expensive, my margins are smaller in Provo. But if you're a landowner looking to sell, now you might have to sell your land for less because you need to attract, a builder who can have the margin that they're looking for. So I think the net, when it all plays out, is probably depressing land prices a little bit in Provo, but the demand is so strong anyways, I think they're already high. The one caveat is there may be some areas that could redevelop, but will stay unredeveloped for longer because that value isn't there to cause it to redevelop because that's being suppressed by inclusionary housing policies. Now, that's a lot of thinking through, and there's a lot of steps in there, and I could be off on any number of those steps, but where I try to say, like, we can't just give stuff away, and we can't just, if we're creating, we can't just give houses for cheaper without it coming from somewhere, and that, at least in my mind, is how it chases through and where it comes from.
One of the things that I'm concerned about is I see this basically being a situation for developers, how they're going to do it. And actually, it's the people that live here also for long periods of time who have their kids educated by the teachers who are needing more money. I'd really like to see some way that this is not carried on the shoulders of new development. If there's some way that we can also include people who are receiving the services, the grocer, the police officer, the fireman, that is actually receiving the services here from the residents that are actually receiving the services, not just the new people coming in.
So there's different models. Cliff, did you run into one where instead of putting all the burden on the developer and the property owner, where the community says, hey, if you build some affordable housing units, we'll actually give you some kind of incentive to do that?
There's a lot of ways to achieve the policy aims. So sometimes, I think in the worst case, you require a developer to just provide them, and it then effectively acts as essentially a tax on the developer, not where they're paying the city necessarily, but they're having to provide the extra units, and either they or the other people that share in those units are eating the cost. The other way is for the city to find incentives. For example, we talked about you could waive connection fees or impact fees if that's at the other extreme, right? You could provide land that the city has as part of a partnership to develop units somewhere. And so there's lots of different tools in between. So you just have to figure out what it is you want to accomplish. And in Provo, where you have so much affordable housing now, and there'll still be advocates who say we don't have enough, right? But you could go into any city in this county and probably in this state and say you don't have enough affordable housing, right? So given the numbers we have, as we talked about at various times in the committee, one of the thoughts that comes out of this is promote home ownership. And then if you promote home ownership, how do you do that? And that's where we spent a lot of time talking about community land trusts and things. So there are ways to do it. Even if you, so let's take the idea that if you were to provide impact fee waivers for a certain number of units.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
So we studied impact fees for months and months and months and months. We came to a fair, even thing. And now we're saying, okay, now after all that work, we said, we're going to use impact fees to do this, so now we're going to put the burden on everybody else that has an impact.
And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, is it's not, if you want to have the public pick up some of the cost, that's one way to do it, right? And that's why if you wanted to do it, to make sure you weren't providing it to every affordable unit, and you were targeting it to a specific type, like a home ownership type, then you might only be providing so many impact fee waivers a year that would be spread in the tax base or the revenue base as you actually go to pay up for that infrastructure later, right?
So then for the capital improvements people to put in their sewer water, they're short now.
Yes.
Because they base their budgets on a certain amount of dollars they're making on impact fees.
Right.
If we made a policy that says, well, we're going to cut some of those down, well, then they've got to make it up. So then we come back to impact fees and we say,
and that's really the issue with all of this, right? What extreme or where in between do you spread the cost of an affordable housing policy if you have one?
A quick on that, I believe impact fees can't be raised because they can only cover,
right,
they're set like as you know. And so what happens to make up that shortfall is rates. Rates would go up. Rates that are paid by everyone, which I believe
well, they would do less. I mean, the capital improvement.
Or the capital, right.
Right.
Which, yeah.
So I'm not remembering the name of the development that we approved some time back. You might remember, Dave, where the townhomes were like $200,000.
Is that the Spring?
Yeah, it was down on
Spring
State
Hill.
Street somewhere. Right. Was that? I mean,
No subsidy.
Wasn't that government subsidies?
None.
None. So how did they do that?
part of their business model. They just figured out how to do it in a way that still makes them some money. They probably took a hit on their cap rate, I would think.
I thought I remembered there being something government-related in that, huh?
Certainly not from the city.
The only thing they had to do was work with the government to get the condos FHA approved.
Yeah, they were FHA, so there's some incentive there.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the reason I mentioned that, I mean, I think we were all in agreement that that was a very exciting project because it was affordable ownership, which in our housing situation seems to be a pretty high priority. I mean, I think affordable rentals are also becoming increasingly a problem, although I feel like we need more data on that to sort of identify where the problems are exactly. And that's why I ask about the students versus non-students. But it seems to me that if we don't do anything at all, then I mean, this is sort of the catch-22. If we don't do anything at all, it seems like we end up with a situation that's not good for the community. So, I mean, that's how I'm counterbalancing the pros and cons here, is I keep thinking, well, but if we don't do anything, then you have a situation where housing affordability, especially for ownership, goes up higher and higher and makes it harder and harder for people.
One thing to remember, George, is that Provo does not have to solve the affordable housing for 70,000 students. You know, we have 30,000 BYU students in the area, but we don't have to, the cities around us can help with all the rental needs, right? Provo doesn't have to become a city of 120,000 renters.
No, I know. I'm actually, and not because I'm unsympathetic to student concerns, but my assumption, and maybe I'm wrong in this, is that the student housing situation is a little bit more self-regulated in the sense that, you know, BYU's got its policies and they've got their housing units and so on, but I'm more concerned about the people who, for whom even a rental check every month is 50% of their income or higher, and for anyone who's trying to own where it's out of range, right? I mean, that's what, and I would love to get more data on that just so we have a clear idea of who and where these shortages are happening, because I think that's the problem we got to solve, because that's what leads to a lot of transients. That leads because people are bouncing from, and I saw that actually closer to your neighborhood when I lived down there more than I've seen it in the tree streets, and it's very disruptive to the quality of life. You know, it's just hard. It's hard to get that sense of community going and that sense of stability, because there isn't a toehold in the housing economy for a variety of incomes.
So I like that example of the Spring Creek condos, or whatever that project was called. I do think that, you know, there's a variety of ways to tackle this, and some of the problems are due to our own zoning laws. So you think, okay, you know, there's going to be a development of 40 single-family detached homes, and now 10% or whatever, you know, we're contemplating have to be, you know, affordable, but they kind of have to look like all the others and whatnot. And so now you're taking something that's fairly expensive, and you have to discount it to the point that it's affordable to, you know, 100% AMI or something like that. Another option, you could keep that 10%, but allow more flexibility in our zoning. I think in West Provo, they're grappling with this right now, with the policies as they're writing their plan. There's some neighborhood chairs that are talking about wanting to have 3 housing types in every development, and that way you can build a community if it's done right. Maybe we need to be looking at form-based codes a little bit more, but you can build a community with a variety of housing types that still mesh well together. And it just happens that 10-20% of those, because of the housing type, naturally hits that 100% AMI, or maybe, you know, some are even 90% AMI. and you build that into the communities. And so there's no need to subsidize because our zoning is flexible enough to accommodate different style things, and maybe even dictates that there needs to be some of this mixture in there. And so we can hit these goals without doing any sort of subsidizing or transferring of funds.
That's a great thought right there. That's wonderful. I would agree that there's no free lunch, and that incentive, that kind of model where you say we need a variety of housing, is one way to have, as it were, inclusionary housing. It's like, who's going to pay for it? The property owner, the developer, the city. Well, nobody has extra money, but I have seen in the last couple of years about $1 million last year, and I think the year before, go to rural housing, doing home ownership projects down in Salem. Now, why is it going to Salem? Do we not need some home ownership, affordable housing here? Well, we do, but we don't have a community housing, let's see, they call them CHODOs, Community Housing Development Organization or something. And so we only have so many of these nonprofits, and rural housing is one of them, Habitat's another, Provo Housing was one, and NeighborWorks. And that was one of the reasons why I tried to get things kind of resolved with NeighborWorks after everything blew up on the economy, is if you don't have somebody that can take advantage of the money that is coming to us from CDBG or home dollars from the feds. These are dollars that are not impacting our utilities or our general fund or our developers and property owners. And if we can get our housing partners to be proposing projects, whether it be pocket neighborhoods or different things that are creative that can help fill this gap. But going back to what you were saying, a variety of housing, wow. When I was on the council the first time, and we were struggling because the west side has always said, we don't have move-up homes, and people just disappear. And it was like, well, what if you said the development had to have an average, and so that means some are smaller and some are larger, and you have a variety.
So we are running out of time on this item. In response to your comment, let me just say that I feel like perhaps it's because we, going on the council, don't have a clear vision of how we want, what we want to do with these federal funds. We don't know, and I think our partners, the CHO partners, have heard us say, well, we want affordable housing distributed throughout the county, and so that's, I think, why we saw what we saw last time. And so I think if we can have a clear vision of this is what we're trying to achieve, and these are the methods that we want to use to achieve it, then I think we'll be able our partners will be able to better work with us in achieving that.
And the point I was making about NeighborWorks is they've been basically out of the game, and until you kind of settle the books and start fresh, they have nothing to do in Provo. There's nothing to offer.
Which is a good point. I think a couple of times we've had in this meeting some good presentations by our RDA, and NeighborWorks, and I think a couple of times now we clearly said that we want this resolved. So do we know where that's at this point?
The last I heard from David Walter is Dan Gonzalez had to take one of the properties back to the consortium because the consortium was somehow having to buy off on the settlement. And that's all I know. I would like to think it's moving forward, but things tend to move slowly.
Any other parting thoughts before we move to the next item?
I just keep thinking about the word Mr. Van Buren used, redistribution. It does seem like what we're talking about is making housing more affordable for those whose incomes are below a certain line. But it seems like the inevitable result of that is that the housing will be a little less affordable for another group that is above that line. Because, like you said, the money's got to come from somewhere. So I'm just trying to understand what the policy objective is to make it more affordable for this group, less affordable for this group, and where we apparently already have the highest ratio of housing for this group in our city relative to other cities, from what I understand. That's kind of my questions.
There's a model that's being used down in Spring, which development was it? They've got homes for $200,000 per buyer. They've got a model that somehow works, so maybe we need to see what that model is.
So that very same property, a previous proposal, prospective buyer came in with super high density. He says, oh yeah, I can't make it with MDR, I've got to have HDR. It was the moon. That fell through, and the next buyer comes in, somehow gets it cheap enough that he's selling them really reasonable. So part of it is just the sale price, and yes, maybe part of it's their profit margin.
And part of it's got to be the product too. I mean, obviously you can build a 1,000 square foot building for $50 a foot or $300 a foot. That's got to all be in the mix.
Just real quick, the Housing Committee is going to have one last meeting this year where we invite all the newly elected councilors, and we're going to review the things that we've done, things that are being worked on, like the housing audit, so we can better understand the needs of the community, and go over ideas like inclusionary zoning. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, there's no free lunch. You can't make something for one person more affordable without making it more expensive for somebody else, or for everyone else. And so how do you, how much money do you put into that kind of a program, and how do you use the federal funds that come in that are basically meant to do that very thing? And I think we can do better by bringing some of it back to Provo and not having it so much of it go everywhere else.
Okay, so with that, we just hit 40 minutes, we'll call it. And move to item 4, a discussion regarding the policy direction for the allocation of sewer connections for developments west of I-15. We only have 20 minutes for this, and this will be presented by Mr. Evans.
So really quickly, we just wanted to remind you, you have that document we had last time. So these are the policy recommendations we made last time that you asked us to put into code. So give priority, make sure there's indirect access is resolved, limit the developments to 40 units and phase them, make sure we don't transfer the sewer connections, and then how do we track them and things like that. So Brian has largely been doing this work, and then he's consulted with the rest of us that have been involved in the committee working on this to put the language in place, and he's going to walk you through it.
You have that coming up, Hannah. So and this is based on your motion in the last meeting. This is going to the Planning Commission tomorrow night, and right now what's noticed for the Planning Commission is an amendment to 1503-100, which is our current adequate public facilities ordinance that says that all development needs to be reviewed to see if there are adequate public facilities. Kind of since we originally did that noticing, Bill and I have both talked. What you're seeing right now, what the Planning Commission is going to see, is a proposal to add a subsection 2 to that section. I think that Bill is going to recommend to the Planning Commission, and I'm probably going to recommend after they come out, that instead of doing that, that we actually make this its own section and have it be 1503-105 and just be its own section. But that's just a technical issue. So we start off by saying that there's limited sewer capacity, and this is version 2. Do you have version 3?
Oh, sorry. I thought this was version 3.
While she's looking for that, I can still just go ahead and describe it. So the first section just says there's limited sewer capacity, so we're imposing some regulations to development projects within the catchment area of the 36-inch sewer main. So the first requirement really is on the city, which is actually that the city's going to monitor the sewer capacity and the projects that have been approved or submitted. It's going to model projections and report those projections regularly to the council and make them available to the public. And let's see, it might be, do you have access to your email? It might be easiest to just go to the email I sent you.
I'm pulling it up right now.
And then as far as the development projects themselves go, there's a section in here that says development projects shall be allocated sewer connections from the currently available connections only upon meeting the following requirements. And the requirements are that the Director of Public Works determines there's adequate capacity, that the project plan demonstrates that they have a connection to the 36-inch sewer main using gravity sewer lines with adequate capacity, and that is or will be in place before the building permits are requested. So I'm down in B3 at the moment. Okay, so that there isn't a lift station other than already master planned system improvements, that zoning is in place, and that the project plan has been approved. So those are the requirements that they would have to meet. Then in sub C, there's a limitation that says they may only receive 40 connections unless it's a phased project, but even a phased project can only get 40 at a time and can't get 40 more until 50% of a previous phase has occupancy certificates.
So Brian has been
Yeah.
at time, as far as
Right.
calendar time.
Right. Although we did talk about putting that in, and that just hasn't, I didn't get there yet. So we were still revising this at a noon meeting today. So I need to make a...
What do you mean by calendar time? Does that mean
You have to use that within a certain period?
Or they only
Time
get so
over
many a year, or 6 months, or like if it's.
They couldn't just hold on to it if they
I
didn't
just,
make
yeah, and
progress
that's
on their
something I'm
phase.
concerned about. I don't know if we can charge something to, and then,
Well, what our intent was, and that just didn't make it into this draft as I was making all the other changes, was to just say, if you receive an allocation, you haven't used it within 18 months, you lose it.
That's fine.
Okay. So,
The allocation would come upon project plan approval, and project plan approval should expire in 18 months. If they don't move on with it, it expires. That's where that came from.
yeah. So sub D says they're not transferable. Sub E grants the Director of Development Services the ability to review the application and make sure that, in his judgment, it's not really a subterfuge for just being all one project. It has been divided up through some, what we referred to in the meeting today as sham transactions. But anyway, when it's not intended to avoid it. And then subsection F is the sunset provision that says when all of the sewer capital improvement projects related to the west side that are listed in the impact fee facilities plan are completed, this section automatically goes away. So that's what we've got so far. That's what's going to go to the Planning Commission, although I will try to add the time limitation in and get that to you so that they can see that version as well. And then so anyway, we just wanted to let you know that's where we got with what was presented in the last meeting and answer any questions.
Now, I will tell you that Bill and I have both been approached, received phone calls from a developer who is asking for a separate standard for multifamily units. The argument being that a multifamily unit can go through their allocation much faster. And we both had the same answer essentially, was that the reason we didn't do that was we wanted to allow the phasing of these developments to continue during the period of the project, not have them all used up right at the front, because one developer grabs onto all of them, and develops them that much faster. So in that way, it allows you to continue to focus on single-family dwellings, and if somebody wants to still put in multifamilies, they can do that, but not at such a pace that they can chew up all of the allocations available.
Related to that, the school bond obviously didn't pass. It's still not clear. I suppose it won't be for a while yet, whether or not it's going to come back again next year and in what form, whether or not Dixon is going to be proposed to be staying where it is, or whether it's going to be proposed to be moving again. In the case of it being proposed to move again, and it does pass, and we've already allocated everything in the next year or something.
And that's a good question, because
Of course, I guess by that point, I mean, we're talking 2025, we're going to be ready anyway for just about anything.
And that's really one of the issues. Once it dropped off, I mean, they probably will come back next year, but there was a clause in the policy statements that we adopted, the council approved, that did say to provide for the school, and of course we knew that by the 19th we would know what that answer was going to be, and it appears to that it has failed, but it is possible they come back. But even at that point, if it passes next year, I mean, you're really then 4 years out before those projects come online, if the next bond even includes a move up Dixon.
So it's not really.
So I asked, and you got me an answer, Cliff. I asked, when are we going to have the written part of the West Side Master Plan or Southwest Plan done? And that's what, it was like January.
We should start seeing some reports on that and come to council in the new year.
Right, and
Sounded like by spring.
I just feel almost like we're getting the cart before the horse a little bit, where we are talking about allocating things and we don't quite know what our priorities are, or at least we haven't put them into writing in a concrete manner with the West Side or Southwest plan. I would like to see that plan finished, and I would like to make sure that we've got our priorities addressed, whether it be the airport, Center Street, and Geneva, where maybe if we could get a grocery store and whatever else goes with it, that would be high priority. If we didn't have sewer connections for that, we'd be sorry. So residential is not necessarily the top of the list if you look at everything out there.
Thank you for that, Colin. I apologize, I wasn't here at the last meeting, and so I sat through a riveting YouTube rebroadcast, but wasn't able to participate. But I've been thinking on this a lot, and I think that how we allocate sewer capacity is a very important question, and I think communicating that with the development community is really important as well, so they know what to expect. They're not blindsided, or they don't have this uncertainty. I think this is a great plan that's been put together, but I actually feel like this is just a small portion of the overall question. And I think I saw some slides from last time where there are some projects that need this already. There's some land out there that can connect to the 36, has zoning already in place. Maybe they don't have a project plan, but they've already hit these major hurdles, and once they get that project plan, if they don't already, then it's pretty automatic from what I see based on these rules. It's automatic. They get it until there's this limit of 40. And if I remember the slide right, we have enough sewer capacity to accommodate and more what's already been zoned out there. So really where the bottleneck's going to come is on properties that we the council, rezones. And as soon as we rezone it, they're in line, and yeah, they're only throttled by that 40, but I think after that point, there's no longer that judgment of, is this forwarding our goals for the area? Is this aligned with the West Provo Master Plan, Area Master Plan. That's our decision at the time of rezone. And so what I see with this is this just keeps people from thwarting the connections and throttles it with the 40. But I don't think this pulls any of the responsibility off of the council. I think when we start talking about, if there is a project, and we have to be careful about people promising things they can't deliver, but if there's a project that said, well, we can bring in, a grocery store, or, there may be a proposal that's all apartment buildings, or another proposal that's all single-family detached, or whatever, I think it's still going to be on the council to decide how well does that plan or the proposal align with the plan that we've adopted. And so I think that's where a majority of this allocation is going to be.
Councilor, I'd just like to agree with that and say, that's been part of the internal discussions we've had in developing this, that really in my mind, there's really only kind of two purposes for even having this ordinance. One is to signal to developers what the council's intent is before they get the rezone package in front of the council, and give them a kind of a little heads up about what the review of that rezone package is probably going to look like. And two, to place the 40 allocation throttle on the little bit of land that is already rezoned, right? Because if it weren't for those two reasons, one of the council's options in this whole situation could be just to not do the ordinance and just re-ask themselves these questions every single time a rezone comes up, right? And one of the fears is that, like, let's say that the 40 is considered to be the right and best policy. One of the fears is if you don't put that in the ordinance, then the council is going to be faced with the temptation / question / begging every rezone to deviate from that standard if it's merely something that's been talked about and it isn't codified. Now, obviously, you can change the ordinance later as well, right? But that's a little bit harder, right? But I think that's right, that this should not be viewed, at least by the council, this ordinance should not be viewed as ending the questions that will be coming to them on this issue, because aside from that parcel in the middle of the area that is already zoned, all of these questions are going to come back to you on every single project because of the need for the rezone.
I think there's been as many rumors of developments that will bring a grocery store as sightings of Bigfoot up Provo Canyon. But I do know that there are, I've heard of some of these, and I do wonder if this 40 could cause certain developers that have been trying to work out trades and swaps and things to say, well, if we can only build 40 at a time, we can't do this, and it kills something like that. So first, this is not, doesn't answer all the questions. We still should probably have a good policy and communicate that with the development community, what we're looking for. And I think that's the Southwest Master Plan, Southwest Area Master Plan. I think that's really, really where that comes in. I think this is really good. Other than I could see it causing us problems if we have a couple of home run developments that really get us something that we've been looking for a long time, and then it hobbles us. So.
Then is it potential? Can we potentially, if we get those home runs, or we can potentially look at some of the acceleration plans that we had in the past? If we find that home run, we've talked about accelerating certain things. So maybe that's something we can consider that if we get those.
My understanding of accelerating was not that we would be building that 36-inch pipe any sooner. That's the real bottleneck.
But we accelerated for Duncan.
Well, we had a certain amount of capacity, and you do things upstream, but downstream, when it has to get underneath the freeway, That's the bottleneck. So we have a limit.
Well, we have a limit as long as we limit ourselves. And I understand, I think there are opportunities that we could, I don't know what they'd be right now. And I don't know where we go with that, but if we get that home run, that maybe you're talking about, that the council sees, yeah, we really need this one.
So
Then we start looking at the vision and say, what can we get? How can we do it?
my understanding of what was proffered, like, we'll help build things in West Provo, whether it be a lift station or bigger pipes. You can do all sorts of things west of the freeway to kind of make it easier for people that are farther away from the trunk line to develop. But that just means that the 400 you've got can be spread out over a larger area. It doesn't increase the 400. The only way you do that is to build that 36-inch pipe. And that's the $15 million elephant.
And what I hear Mr. Wilkinson saying is if we get a truly home run project, would we then consider some way or another finding $15 million to accelerate that? Which generally the council has said, no, we're not interested in doing that, but for the right project, would we be willing to? I guess my question for Mr. Jones would be, if that home run project presents itself, I imagine a future council could.
Right, you could go in and repeal this early, you could go in and leave it as is, but delete the 40. There's going to be, there could be some political backlash, right? From developers that were subject to the 40 and feel like it's unfair that now subsequent ones aren't, but that's probably part of the home run deal or arrangement, right? But it does reduce your flexibility a little bit, as opposed to, again, kind of weighing the pros and cons, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. If we didn't worry about the ordinance and you instead just said, well, developers, we just want you to know that it's our intent when you bring us a rezone package that we're inclined not to approve rezones that don't include phasing because we're worried about the connections. End of sentence, right? Then every time you're going to get a pitch from the developer that ours is the one that should deviate from that intent.
There's the home run.
So there's more pressure on you, but there's more flexibility if you get the one that you think is the home run.
So the reason why I brought up the Southwest Area Master Plan is we have a map, but we don't have the language. And if we finalize the language, I think we would have a better idea, and everyone else would, of what the home run looks like.
I agree with that, and I guess speaking to us as a council and the incoming members as well, I think we might want to seriously consider seriously considering not rezoning anything additional until that language is in place.
And I think we just need to remember, we're not that's 7 years. Every meeting we have, we're closer to that 7 years of having it done. So our problem becomes, if the home run comes in a year, well, that's only 5 or 6 years, and that might be quick, our problem gets smaller and smaller as every council meeting comes. And so we need to make sure, too, that Public Works is stand on that 7-year calendar, that we don't kind of plan on it. Look, and also, all right, 8 and 9.
We on track, Gary?
Yes, it's serious.
We'll take you on a field trip if you want to see what's being done. It's crazy.
Okay, so without any action, it will go to Planning Commission with tomorrow as we see it, but plus an 18-month time limit. Mr. Jones?
Say that again, sorry.
So if we don't take any action, this will go to the Planning Commission tomorrow with a draft similar to this, but with an 18-month time limit on it.
Right, I've just added a new subsection that says an allocation of sewer connections under this subsection 2 shall expire 18 months from the approval of the project plan unless the building permits for the project have been issued.
All right.
So
you're still productive even in the midst of all this.
So that's what's going to go to Planning Commission tomorrow, and then you'll get it back next week for a first hearing.
Okay, so.
Was the intent.
So we can mull over these things for a week and then back again in a week. Okay, thank you, everyone. Item 5 is a discussion regarding parking permit program policies. And this is budgeted for 10 minutes. And I am presenting it. So I appreciated you guys taking this item 2 weeks ago. I really thought I'd be able to call in, but was not able to. But I think the council discussion covered 90% of what I was hoping that it would. So basically, we've done residential parking permit programs for decades in Provo. Already we've made changes. I think just this year we made some changes. Put in that they're enforced using license plate readers, no longer have the tags hanging from windows and whatnot. So already it has changed. And just based on discussions in the Walking Parking Committee, the Downtown Parking Committee, this committee work's not done yet, but the direction of it feels like we may be going more and more to mobile pay. So if you park at the airport, you won't get a ticket and put in your money in a booth coming in and out, but you use an app on your phone or call a 1-800 number and make your payment with the mobile pay system. For example, and depending on how things work out, we may, instead of having meters in high traffic areas, similarly could just be signs saying, use this app or call this number. And how does that look? How might that look in our neighborhoods that are looking for a residential parking permit? I mentioned, I think, in the kind of the information on this, and I assume others have seen this as well, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've had a number of parking permit programs proposed, and sometimes there's fairly unreasonable expectations of, well, I want the street in front of my house to be reserved solely for me, kind of thing, and once a full plan is kind of discussed, put in place, what can be done and whatnot, and then as more and more neighbors become aware of it, many of those have lost public support and we haven't moved forward with them. I think it's important that residents kind of have a realistic expectation of what's possible, and what's possible is changing. One example of what might, and again, this is all still in committee or whatever, but one possibility is instead of having like visitor tags or visitor, allocations of visitor parking that you can call into the city, and some people have complained that it's a bit onerous. You have to, there's no automated way to do it. You have to call in and you have to do all of this stuff. Perhaps it's signs that say, basically paid parking on street unless you have a residential permit. And that way, if you have friends over for, that birthday party, either you or they can pay 25 cents for 4 hours, whatever the going rate is, because a lot of these areas wouldn't have that much pressure once there's even a small payment required for parking. But then you'd have this space available for those kind of events, and a host might not have any problem spending $2 for all their guests to come, but that person that lives in the development just across the, down the road or whatever, they're not going to want to pay 50 cents every day. It ends up being $15 a month or whatever. It might be enough that it deters people from parking there. Anyway, so that's an example of some of the things that are being discussed in these committees, and So I think these next few proposed parking permit programs as community and neighborhood services creates that plan, investigates and all that, I'm very interested to see what options come back out and how the residents react to that.
So there was a proposal that we discussed briefly that's gone to planning commission for the Carterville neighborhood.
Yeah.
Anyway, you're aware of that. I mean, so this was, without this conversation, when I met with them, I didn't go over in any kind of detail because I was not aware of that information about variations on the theme, basically, of a parking permit program. I mean, I guess we'll just wait and see what happens with the planning commission. It's not clear to me what's structurally problematic for that particular neighborhood is that there are neighboring developments that are either over-occupied or insufficient parking is already provided, and so there's people who are just regularly parking there for their everyday use, or every night use.
If I heard the recording correctly, probably the biggest group that's in there are from the Bradbury apartments. Bradbury. And if I heard it right, they have more than sufficient parking on their site. It's just more convenient because it's just across the bridge. So depending on where you live, it's more convenient to park out on the street and then walk across the bridge to your house. And so, even 50 cents a night there might be sufficient to change that behavior and have them park in the parking that's already exists that's there for them, and then the parking permits would be purchasable by people who live along those streets and not in the development. So that is an example of how that might play out in that. But one of the reasons why parking permit programs often don't go through is because it becomes a pain for someone to have visitors. And if you have a simple, quick way for people to be able to park there as visitors, but still deters the kind of parking abuse, I guess you could call it, that you're trying to deter, then that might be a very attractive option.
So I like what you were talking about, changing the model so that the visitor parking is not limited to a certain number, or, gee, I've already used up my allocation for the year, so I can't have another party. It's just there. It's paid parking, and you can have 5 people, you can have 10 people. They can stay as long as they want if they're going to pay. And then the host doesn't have to go, oh, let's see, I've got 10 people and I've got to get on the computer and put in 10 license plates, and if I forget one of them, he'll get a ticket. The person that comes is the one that gets on his phone and takes care of it.
The host would still have that option. In my mind, obviously this all has to be implemented or whatever, but in my mind, a host or anyone could go in and say, for this zone, I want to pay for these license plate numbers. And so if someone wanted to do that as a host, they would have that option. Or the guests themselves could as well, just depending on, those I believe would be options.
But if it's on a pay basis, then you don't have to go in and keep track of, well, how many have I used this year?
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So that was my intent for bringing up this issue. Any comments on it?
You're not talking about reserving parking at all.
Nope.
Yeah, that's going to say you can't,
Even if they pay for it, if it's not available, it's not available.
Correct. This is only a license plate reader that drives down the street, reads that number, and just asks, are they okay to be here or not? Do they need a ticket or not?
And that's why I think as we ruminate over this, it may just be simpler for the guest who drives in to look around for an empty spot, pull in, get out their phone and say, okay, I'm going to register, I'm going to pay, and they take care of it. And so you're not necessarily saying, well, I bought a space for you, you couldn't find a space. Well, it's just all up to the customer with the car rather than the owner.
Yeah, and that would be open however people want to do it. Okay,
think I nailed the 10 minutes on that. So we are now to a 5-minute break. Plan to reconvene at 3 p.m. Let's just,
Guys, before we break, just notice, Dan Johnson, who is the, what do they call it, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Water Board, he's the manager. He's the hired person that owns the rest of the committee. His wife died Friday night. And I was wondering if maybe as council, I'm not sure when the funeral is, but if we would like to make note of that, maybe send something to that.
I think that that's a good idea. And I would like it, if possible, from council, because we've had there's been a little bit of I'd like to recognize them as a council.
thank you. Yeah. Okay. So let's get back here at 3:08. We'll start at 3:08 precise. Item 6, an ordinance amending Provo City Code to update public works standards from 2019 standards to 2020. It's a citywide application and will be presented by Mr. David Day, Development Engineering Coordinator for Provo City, and this is budgeted for 10 minutes.
I'm David Day with Provo City Public Works. Thanks for having me. And if we don't need to go 10 minutes if you don't want to. Based on your input. So every year, you've seen me before, we go through our standards and we try to find problems with them and fix them. So this is the result of this last year's compilation of things that we were questioned on or things that were missing, and we're trying to fix things and make them better. So this first page you see is just basically the proposed ordinance change, and it's very simple. Simply, you scroll down, you can just notice the changes in the dates. We did add right at the very bottom a reference to Utah Administrative Code. That's to bring all of the water and sewer codes into a reference. They're still by law, they have to follow them, but it's just to make it easier for somebody to know where to look. So that's the code change. There's about 40 pages of these. I can just kind of tell you, you probably already have it in your packet, but the area is in blue. Can you pull that down just a little, or just maybe make it a one-page view? But the blue area is highlighted as something we've added. So we had a question on our asphalt, for instance, and we've just defined that a little clearer for them. So I'll click through these really quick. Basically text, making it clearer. Thank you. If you have any other questions, just jump in and ask me. These are fairly technical, and so I'll just go through them rather quickly. All of these are the same changes, but they're just different configurations of inlet boxes. A lot grading detail that shows two options instead of one. We used to just have one, and we thought, well, we'll give them another option. There's a million other ways they could grade a lot, but we're just saying here's some ideas to get you started. So, and then the notes that go with them, a profile of grading for lots, some ideas on some additional information that's supplied on this sewer lateral detail. I'll try to get to some that are more exciting. We had the boring detail last year. I don't know if you remember that, but
Why would you think those weren't exciting?
Hey, they were great. I'm not a civil engineer, but I have an engineering background in a different area. But I went through every page, and it was interesting.
Yeah,
Both
okay.
the changes as well as the black text that wasn't changing.
Yeah, okay.
It's kind of fun. But I'm weird that way.
Me too, so.
Dave, I was going to suggest just going through the cross sections. That's probably the biggest issue is the modifications to the road cross sections.
Yeah, so last year, I remember we went through a pretty extensive effort to change our road cross sections. And so this year on our intersection designs, you can see the little numbers in blue. Those are to be the same numbers as what we changed last year. So that's simply just to make that the same road width as our cross sections we approved last year. So there's several of those different widths and stuff. This year we added gas and communications and power into our road cross-section, as well as showing where placement of those can go to make the road area usable for all the utilities that need to be there, Dave.
So if you were to superimpose a turning radius of a semi or certain size vehicle, at some point you limit the types of vehicles.
Yeah, for instance, this is probably one of the tighter looking intersections that we would have. A cement truck or a concrete truck that would come here would have to come over here and track and maybe even run over the top of that curb to make that turn. And that's by design. We really don't want those kind of trucks in neighborhoods, but while it's being built, that's what happens. And one of the reasons we have that inch overlay after a development is built is to fix all the issues that come as a result of building the homes. So.
I look at those cross sections, those intersections with the bulb outs, and I get excited about that as well, just thinking of how comfortable that would be to stroll through that neighborhood with those shorter crosses.
Yeah, your maximum distance here is 24 feet to cross. That's just 2 lanes of travel traffic, so it's really pretty tight. This is a brand new detail that we just put in this year, and it's probably kind of hard to understand, but the problem that we've noticed is with all the communication companies that are hanging on our power poles, they're blocking, you can't see the signal light because the lines run in front of the signal and you can't see the whole green or yellow or red ball. And so it's obscuring that vision to those safety devices, and we've tried to decide how to handle that, and we've come to you with this possible solution. What it does is it puts them 3 feet above the signal with the drooping communication lines, or 5 feet in back. If they get down to where they're in front, we've had people say, hey, I didn't know that was a red light because I couldn't see it, and that is a big problem. So this is to keep those lines out of that area where we need to be able to see the light. So that's brand new. It's not all in blue, but it's all new. It should be blue. And then the rest of the text here are changes to our design standards. So it's just all text. A lot of it's water and sewer and storm drain. I'll just go through that really quick. That's it. So any questions on any of that? Dave?
I don't have a question or comment. I just want to applaud your efforts this year. This was really helpful. I think the first time that we did this standards by reference model, we saw just the code change, which was great. We were going from last year's to this year's, but it was very helpful to see what the actual changes were, and it just increases my appreciation for what your department does to see how detailed this is and communicating those standards, and I appreciate just how well this was delivered to us in a very digestible manner, so we could see, yeah, we're going from 19 to 20, but what does that mean? And you really showed us what that means, so thank you.
Thank you. We've struggled with how to do that. In the past, I don't know if you remember the overlaid drawings where it would change color if something changed, but they got really busy and hard to see, so hopefully this was easier.
Any other comments? All right, thank you, Mr. Day. Appreciate it. All right. Item 7 is an ordinance, probably a discussion on an ordinance applying the supplemental residential overlay to the one-family residential R18 zone for real property generally located between 2320 north and approximately 2100 north, and between 350 east and approximately 250 east in the Pleasant View neighborhood. This will be presented by Mr. Dustin Wright for the city planner, and this budget is 10 minutes.
Thanks. So this property here outlined in red is the area. It's in the Pleasant View neighborhood. The applicant's requesting the rezone of, so there's 32 homes in that area. And they've been working with those neighbors to see who would be in favor of that. I've got pretty good support from what I understand. This item went to the Planning Commission back in May, and the Planning Commission recommended approval to the City Council for the rezone from the R18 to the supplemental overlay zone. And so then following that meeting, it went before the council, and the item was continued to allow for a couple of things. One of them, if you remember, was the S&A overlay ordinance amendment. That was a separate application that was kind of going through at the same time. You guys wanted to make sure that got through first and then bring this back after that. So the last council meeting, or maybe the one prior to that, S&A overlay zone got approved, and so now this is coming back to you. Another one of the things was parking was a concern that was brought up at those meetings, and specifically along 2320 North, you've got the Centennial Middle School and Rock Canyon Elementary up there, and so parking along there was something that they wanted to look at, kind of separate from this, but it was brought up as this discussion. So while it was an item that was continued, that was looked into. So Austin Taylor, over at parking, looked at it and was able to get bike lanes put in along 2320 North, and then remove the parking along the street. So we feel like that will help with those concerns that were addressed previously. And so yeah, this item's just coming back tonight for you guys to look at. So if there's any questions you had or anything, I'd be happy to answer those now.
Where it says the majority of the homeowners approve, how many is the majority? I mean, is it 50% or 75% or 80%?
Yeah, the applicant might be able to answer that better, but my understanding was it was about 50% of that.
Yes, we had gotten just over 50%. The issue we had into running into this was a lot of the homeowners do not live in Utah. They live out of state and they rent these homes out. And so getting in contact with them has been difficult. But we were able to get that 50%. And there are a lot of people who are renters, and they are obviously with just the one dwelling homes like that. This would not affect those homes because the owner is not living there, so they would not be able to do an accessory apartment.
Can you do this in estimate? So we've got 50% of people that have gone on your record of saying that they support it. You haven't been able to contact a lot of people. What's been the percentage of people that say, I understand this, but I don't agree with it, so I don't like this?
We've had about 2 households that have been opposing this,
Okay.
from what we've been able to see.
Your 50%, how many households does that represent?
It was 56, going back, sorry, this was a few months ago, it was about 18 homes.
So
Of the 36 homes, we had 18 homes.
18 homes say yes, roughly 2 said no. Yeah, they don't know.
And were those 18 homes owner occupied?
Yes. There were a few we had about 3 or 4 that were out of state, where they were renters that approved it. And then the other ones were owner occupied, yes.
Brian, this was brought to us now, is this under the council rule? We've already had one hearing on this, correct? And it's come back with, because we looked at this isn't, because it was such a long time ago, we are still able to vote on this tonight, correct?
Yeah.
Is this something that's a council member can postpone?
Which number is it tonight?
It's number 6, I believe.
Yeah, I believe that's accurate. So this, so it was in Planning Commission on May 8th. Chair notes say it's a first hearing, but I didn't look that up. So it has been.
Because I'm looking at it now, I double checked our records and it was heard on the 21st.
So you can vote on it. Now, somebody can always make a motion to continue it. That would have to be.
But it's not subject to the
It's not
rule that
subject
if
to
one
an
person.
automatic continuance.
We'd still need a whole majority to be able to continue.
I'm happy to vote on this tonight, but if some people feel like it would be helpful to have let the public talk about it a little more, I wouldn't be opposed to postponing it, but
I think we've done that.
I think we have. I think we're about there, so. All right, any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Wright. Item 8 is a resolution consenting to the assignment and assumption of parking license agreement between 63 East Investors, LLC, Base Camp 7, 64, LLC, and Provo I, LLC. Not quite sure what all that means, but here to explain that for us is Mr. David Walter, our Redevelopment Agency Division Director.
Mr. Chair, members of the council, good afternoon. So the item before you tonight concerns parking for 63 East, the residential parking. So similar to in the past, when this property is transferred hands, we have had to consent to allow the existing parking to be transferred to the new ownership. So the board sold it to PEG, we went ahead and consented to that. Now that PEG is selling it to this new entity, they're asking for the same consent. Their financing people are asking for the same consent. So we are proposing that the council adopt a resolution that would give the mayor in her capacity as the chief executive administrator of the redevelopment agency to sign the assent to the transfer of the parking rights for 63 East from PEG Development in their capacity, in their incarnation as 63 East Investors to this new group. It's fairly.
But what is Provo I?
It's the name that they came up with for their LLC.
So that's not us?
No, no.
Okay.
Is it Provo I or Provo 1?
It could be Provo 1.
I think it's a Roman numeral 1.
Roman 1.
Gotcha. All right.
Kind of the base camp threw us off, so the Provo 1, Provo I threw us off. It's like, but I mean, they're creating these LLCs strictly for this venture, so.
So currently 63 East is apartments, correct? Not
Yes.
condos.
Yes, not condominiums.
They are apartments. The redevelopment agency participated in this project.
The redevelopment agency participated in the project through assembling property and providing some funding. And so you may remember, I believe it was about the end of 2015 or the beginning of 2016, they cashed out. There was an option in the joint development agreement that allowed them to cash out for $150,000 or to share profits with us on an ongoing basis. They opted to cash out, and so that, our involvement now is simply the parking, providing the parking. And that was, the lease was one of the attachments to the joint development agreement when this was approved.
Go ahead.
No, just question, and these parking spaces, because of an agreement with the owner of the property,
Yes.
are allocated.
Yes.
And they're
So
not,
if you
and
go-
dedicated.
And dedicated. If you go onto the
Allocated,
lower
dedicated.
2 levels of the Wells Fargo parking structure, you'll see the signs. Currently, they say set aside for PEG development with a number attached to them. I would imagine they will change to whatever entity will be picking up the leases with the residential tenants.
So why did the redevelopment agency choose to participate in, say, parking and this? I mean, what city goals were we trying to achieve?
I think it was downtown revitalization and providing a more vibrant atmosphere and bringing more people into the downtown community. So in addition to the commercial development, which we're on the first floor with Roll With It and Good Time Eatery,
we got the 42 units that are, so we have more of a population base in the downtown.
We had, I think, 63 East. I think there was one before that.
But that was basically the beginning where we're trying to get people to come downtown when we did that. So that was the real reason for it.
Is there any plans to change how this is operating? Is this,
That's my knowledge.
we plan to continue to use it as?
I mean, they have to be, I mean, this is going to be supposition on my part, but they're taking it subject to the existing leases. So.
How long's our agreement with that?
I want to say it expires in 40 years.
So it's
For a while. Not as long as with Mr. Bancroft.
Any other questions? Mr. Walter.
We'll still be providing parking for Mr. Bancroft long after this deal is expired. Yes, yes.
So we're going to
Decide,
hear this
yes.
tonight.
Yes.
And make the decision tonight. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just like that. Item 9 is a discussion regarding electronic sign policy. This will be presented by Councilor Gary Winterton and Mr. Brian Jones. And we have this budgeted for 55 minutes.
As we've talked as a sign committee, there's been a lot of circles, a lot of discussion, and we're getting to the point here that we feel that there's certain things that we can decide on and certain things that
maybe we shouldn't decide on until the next council comes on board.
And I think at certain points, we're trying to get to a point where we can accomplish what we can accomplish. Maybe, and we talked about having a kind of a flow chart where we'd go down and say, this is what we're thinking, this is where we want to go. Are we willing to vote on that at this point? If not, does there need more discussion? But there is a lot of discussion that has taken place, and with that, I'm going to let Brian kind of summarize and kind of help us walk through where we can get to something possibly today to bring it to a meeting where we can vote on something.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Winterton. So let me start off by summarizing a little bit of research. In one of our previous meetings, Mr. Knecht, in fact, had asked for kind of a review of sign case law out there. And we commissioned that, had that done. There wasn't a lot to find. None of it's in Utah. It's not necessarily binding precedent, but there are a couple of interesting cases out there that I just wanted to kind of recount as background for the discussion we're about to have. So one of them regarding electronic signs was a New Jersey case that went to the Supreme Court of New Jersey. And let me read you a couple quotes from the case just to think about, to kind of set the frame. Now, this particular case was about billboards, which are similar to what we're talking about in the sense that it is still commercial speech, but slightly different in the sense that it's off-premises speech instead of on-premises speech, and there's maybe a little bit lower bar there. Anyway, they said, so one of the comments in the case was, billboards are a medium of communication, and any regulation of that medium may not transgress the Constitution of the United States or of this state. Now, in that case, the town had a blanket ban on digital billboards. And the plaintiff came in and said, we own, here's 3 static billboards, here's a digital billboard that we want to put in. There's no difference between them. And the court agreed and said that the ban on digital billboards was not narrowly tailored to promote a substantial government interest, and included this quote, which, I don't want to oversell this, but the quote says, simply invoking aesthetics and public safety to ban a type of sign without more does not carry the day. So the court, in essence, said, okay, we're not saying that aesthetics and public safety are not valid reasons, but you have to point to something. It can't just be we think it's safer, or we think it's prettier to not have these things. You have to have some kind of basis for why you're saying that one type of sign over another type of sign is safer or preserves aesthetics. The second case is a Minnesota district court case where, and this case highlights the legal principle you may have heard me cite before that lawyers like to recite, that is, bad facts make bad law. Right? And the point of that is, when you do something completely unreasonable, you're going to get hammered by the courts, and you're going to get, or the legislature, and you're going to get stuck with something that you don't like in retribution for your unreasonableness. So in this particular case, the city of Minnetonka in Minnesota allowed digital billboards but prohibited them from changing. Period. Ever. Okay? And they based that on public safety, that they didn't want it to ever change in order to reduce distraction to drivers, right? So the court said, well, that's unreasonable, and now this is not necessarily the holding of the case, this is just a comment in the case, but it's still instructive. It says, the court said, there is nothing to show that an electronic change in the message once each hour, day, month, or year poses any distraction different from a billboard crew manually changing the vinyl cover of a conventional billboard, right? And so they said that law was unreasonable and struck it down. So obviously both of those play into a little bit to our discussion, which the committee wanted to bring forward on hold times. And so we've gone, I hope I'm helping. We talked about this in committee about the fact that we really kind of felt like as a committee this discussion was one where the entire council probably needed to have the entire discussion instead of just hearing us, a recommendation from the committee and taking it as the recommendation and moving on. So, but I want to attempt to kind of parse it into sections, because there's kind of a series of questions that we can ask that if the answer to the first question is no, then we don't need to discuss all of the other things. And before, we've kind of tried to put out the recommendation as one piece, even though there's a lot of components to it. So the first component, in my mind, is the question of, should the current low churn hold time be reduced? Right? Just as a threshold issue. Should it be reduced from 3 times a day? And I think there's 3 things. I'm not going to propose an answer to that question. I'm just asking a question. I'll give you 3 things to consider. And then kind of my view was we should actually answer that question before we even move on. And if 4 council members don't want to reduce it, then we don't need to talk about the rest of the stuff on this.
Can I just make sure I am?
Yes.
This is a little bit like when people say, would you turn the air conditioner up? And it's not clear whether they want the temperature to rise or lower.
Right.
So churn time and hold time, can you just,
Yes.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding
Yeah.
this crystal clear.
So Mr. Sewell has pointed out in some of these committee meetings, we probably made a mistake when we referenced churn, used the word churn in our ordinance, because nobody else uses that. Everybody else refers to hold time, okay? So I'm going to try to standardize that and use hold time. So hold time is how long the image has to be static before it can be changed. Currently, our hold time in the low churn area is not actually defined as a hold time. It just says you can't change it more than 3 times per day. Now, you could change it 3 times in 24 seconds and then not change it again for 24 hours. Or you could change it once every 8 hours, or 3 times in 15 minutes. That's one of the problems, right, with the ordinance as it currently stands, is it's actually not very clear. But we have 2 areas of the city: a high churn area, which are defined corridors where it can change more often than 3 times per day, but no more than once every 8 seconds. So nowhere in the city can it change more than 8 seconds. Does that make sense? But we have areas where it can change more than 3 times a day, and areas where it can change no more than 3 times a day. That totally confused. So the question is, should we actually get rid of this low churn definition of no more than 3 times a day and establish a hold time? And should that hold time be something less than 3 times a day?
So can you explain why that's confused, the 3 times a day is all that problematic? I mean, I can understand what you just explained, that you could do it once every 8 hours or once every 8 seconds, but only once for over a 24-hour period. But that still doesn't seem like that problematic to me. I guess I just don't understand what
the problem isn't from confusion.
Okay.
I didn't mean to imply that. So the reasons that have been discussed in the committee for reducing the hold time, bringing it down to something. Well, I'll just throw out there, the
bringing down the hold time increases. This is where
increases the churn.
Increases the frequency of the change.
Right, right. So, and just to throw out there again, this is the second question: is if it should be reduced, what should it be reduced to? Well, the committee's recommendation is at least a minute, meaning that it could change every minute. But we'll get to that in a second. First is this question of should it be possible to change a sign in the low churn areas more than 3 times a day? That's the threshold question, right? And as the committee has talked about this, and please committee members weigh in and correct me where I don't have this right, but I think there's 3 main reasons that the committee has discussed for doing that. One is because the businesses want us to, meaning for the benefit of the businesses. And Hannah was the one that wrote the paper where she went out and did a study about are signs effective and is having greater churn more effective for the business. And she concluded, and I think as she presented that evidence to the committee, that the committee felt that that was accurate, that 3 times a day is not worth very much to the business, right? That as far as increasing their identification and advertising and things like that, it's not terribly effective for them, and we've got a lot of businesses that would like to do something where they've got a monument sign with 15 companies on it, and they'd like to have an electronic sign that cycled through those 15 companies so that it could actually be readable from the street. Instead of having 15 signs that are this big, you could have one sign that's this big and cycle through it. But if you can only change it 3 times a day, that doesn't work for the 15 companies, right? So one reason is for business effectiveness. Another reason is enforcement. And I was hoping Gary McGinn was going to be here, but so he could chime in. But one of the things, he's been coming to our committee meetings, one of the things he's talked about is that in reality, if you think about this logistically, in order to enforce the no more than 3 times a day standard, you have to either set up a video camera or post a code enforcement officer outside the sign for 24 hours to monitor whether it has changed more than 3 times in the 24 hours, right? And that's not really very tenable. And so from an enforcement perspective, it's pretty difficult to enforce. Then from a let me go off on a little bit of a tangent. Say this is maybe a 4th reason, but then the other reason I guess is what is it that it's accomplishing as far as the benefit to the citizens? And Gary will say, and I'm not the one receiving these complaints, so I don't know, but Gary will say that the sign complaints he gets are about the brightness, not about the churn, right? So, so he, from his perspective, I guess this goes back to the business effectiveness, right? Is that he's saying that as long as the brightness is strictly enforced, he doesn't believe that the high hold time, low churn time creates a benefit for the citizens in contrast to the detriment that the businesses are claiming that they're suffering from.
I think the brightness and the size.
Right, for sure. And then my last point was legal, right? Is whether the 3 times a day standard is defensible, right? And there's arguments for and against. There's certainly not a Utah case on point. I think this Minnesota case that says we have no reason to believe that changing a sign every hour is different than taking down the vinyl and putting up a new sign as far as distracting people. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know what my counter to that is, right? As far as, so this goes back to, so these are, the enforcement and the legal thing is conjoined. Those are associated with each other in this way. There are currently signs in the city that are in violation of the 3 times a day, okay? And I don't want to, and it's not just one, in case you think that there are multiple ones. And I don't want to pick on any of the businesses, but the problem is if you're going to have a standard and you're going to enforce it against one, then you need to enforce it against all. And that causes 2 problems. From a policy perspective, do you want to enforce it against everybody? So we've got at least a couple of these little crawler signs that are advertising services provided that switch to a new price and service every minute that are in low churn areas. So do you want to go to those businesses and tell them that they must lower that to 3 times a day? And is the policy question. And 2, the legal question is, if you do that and they challenge us, will we survive the challenge? And again, we don't have in-depth study here. We don't have actual precedent to rely on. But a couple of the cases that I kind of cited in that report are a little bit troubling as far as what is our justification for 3 times a day. So, I think that's probably, yeah.
If you want to get a vote, I can make a motion.
Okay.
Wow. Make a motion that the Provo City Code for electronic signs has a hold time of no less than 8 seconds.
Okay.
So, is there a second to that motion?
Which that is already the case.
That means it could be 4 seconds, it has to be at least 8
Oh, yeah,
seconds.
that's already in there.
Oh.
No, that's in the high churn.
Well, that actually applies everywhere. No less than,
Everyone, but
yeah.
it's-
yeah, no less than 8 seconds is already in the code, right?
Okay, so no less than, okay.
No less than is 8 seconds. Now,
Hold time, no less than 8.
if you want to, what you're saying instead is that it can be as little as 8 seconds
Right.
everywhere in the city.
That's what I'm
That's
saying.
that's a change.
Hold time can be as little as 8 seconds anywhere in the city.
Okay.
That's my motion.
Okay? Is there a second to that?
I kind of like the 1 minute idea. I'd like to discuss that.
And that's where we ended up as a council, I mean, as a committee, as we could see that this is going to be split, and we wanted to have some discussion about why it would be, why maybe 8 seconds, or why maybe 1 minute. We were having a hard time I was having a hard time justifying 1 minute. I can justify an 8 second, because it's a national standard.
Okay.
And it's the standard in most other cities.
And it is a standard in most other cities in Utah.
So I appreciate George's
Why would
motion.
it be different, I guess would be my question. Why would we not have that same national or other city standard? Most other cities.
So, well, I have some questions about Hannah's report and on the safety and so on. I mean, well, there are 2 reports. There's a report on safety and then sort of business effectiveness. It seems to me that, and Hannah's report acknowledges this, that there's not a lot of evidence. I mean, this is one of those things where caution just makes sense to me, but if you're holding me to a standard of proof and I can't prove that it's distracting, then I'm not allowed to argue that it is, right? That just seems totally unfair. You lawyers. And so I really feel like common sense kicks in for me, and I just say, well, I think everyone knows that the reason why businesses want them is that they do attract viewers, they do attract the eyeball, and that's the whole point. And it does seem to me that the more frequently you're changing them, the more likely it is that people are looking at them. And so these things kind of cut
I don't feel like we can have it both ways. I mean, I just feel like if we're acknowledging that they're designed to get your attention, then we have to acknowledge that there is a point at which that attention is problematic. And it's not just, I mean, I'm disheartened about these legal cases, because if you're saying I can't resist this on the basis of safety, and I can't resist it on the basis of aesthetics, then I got nothing. You might as well just like ramp them up and put them all over the place. And as I've said before, this feels like a proverbial slippery slope or rabbit hole, or however you want to put it, because it does seem to me that when you amp up the competition, it then makes it a business disadvantage, right, for people who don't have it. And so then it becomes, so I'm still feeling very nervous about opening up frequency. And I don't know, I guess if it's true that most of the complaints are about brightness and size, and if we got serious about enforcing that, then maybe this is a lesser issue. I guess I'm saying, in light of what you just shared, is it still legally indefensible to say we don't want to be like other cities, because we do believe that this has a distraction value that's not only potentially a safety issue, but also as a city we care about the aesthetics, and we care about light pollution, we care about quality of life in the community, and these are the reasons why. I mean, I say this, and I think I've alluded to this before, but I grew up in the East where billboards and signage were severely limited, and I've always found it very, very difficult to adjust, even though I've lived here for 22 years, but I found it very difficult to accept the norm that is here, that is just, and I know we can't exactly go back on a lot of this, right? I mean, if it were up to me, I guess I would be banning billboards, and I'd be banning all kinds of stuff, and everyone would accuse me of being a dictator or whatever. But I really feel strongly that this is, it's not a healthy way to promote businesses because of where it ends, right? It just never gets to you to a place where you want to be. I mean, if you want to get to Las Vegas Strip, fine. That's what you're going to get, and obviously that's brightness and size and all the other things. But
let me just ask a question and clarify my motion. My understanding is this would only be applied to areas where electronic billboards are allowed, right?
Well, not billboards, but electronic signs, period, right, which are currently allowed everywhere in the city except for residential and agricultural zones.
So it would apply to everywhere except residential and agriculture?
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
And there's a lot of borders between residential and commercial, residential and industrial, so.
And we talked about that, and we felt that that's something that's going to take time to deal with, and that's something that the next sign committee and the next council probably needs to deal with as far as
Buffer zones.
and that's going to take some effort and time to deal with.
I have a ton of thoughts on this. Let me maybe touch on just a couple, though. I kind of wonder if I have a different picture in my head than some of my colleagues on this, and so maybe I need to be straightened out, or maybe we need to broaden what we're thinking about. Reading some of the research, at least, and I did not do the digging into following the links and all of that, but the way that things were written, it seemed like a lot of the comparables that we were making were to billboards. I noticed a lot of that said, well, yeah, it's 8 seconds for billboards, and my understanding, this is where maybe I'm wrong, but when we went through this question of should we allow electronic signs anywhere a backlit sign is allowed, one of my concerns was what exactly does that look like? And so I think that when we were on the dais, I pulled up a picture, coming off of Center Street exit, you get to Ninth West, and there's Carpets America, which just happened to be kind of the spot that I pulled up. Carpets America, if I remember right from back then, they've got their sign out kind of on the street. It's not a monument sign, but it's a sign up there. But then they also have a backlit sign on the side, this side of the building, and then a backlit sign on this side of the building. And I think I asked the question, but all of those are places that they could convert over to an electronic sign. And so you could have a single premise, a single business that has multiple signs. And to have each of those changing every 8 seconds, particularly if they, that worries me. And I could imagine, standing on a street looking down and having multiple businesses each with signs that are changing up to every 8 seconds, and visually what does that do? And so for me, that's just very alarming. And so I guess that's why I'm thinking maybe I misunderstand this proposal. And then let me just wrap this to what you talked about. When we talk to other communities have looked at buffers, and I actually think that that's probably where we need to be looking at. Maybe we have a different standard for the signs that are out on the street versus signs that are on businesses, and maybe we have some of those buffers when they're interfacing with residential. Maybe we can get to a spot where I'd be comfortable with higher churn, hold times. But one of my worries is if we just kind of do a blanket right now saying, a minute or 8 seconds or whatever, it's very hard to undo that just with
Right, could a business have 3 backlit signs, and doesn't our sign ordinance control that? I certainly would be in favor of
That's
it.
probably a better question for Gary.
Yes.
But each face of the building, right?
Well, our signs, our sign ordinance, in general, and there's little permutations, but in general, it works where we come in and we calculate, depending on what zone you're in, how much frontage, in some cases, often it's how big your building is, and then you get so many square feet of signage. And we don't care if that's 1 sign or 10 signs. And so think of a grocery store. They might have a big sign up front that says Joe's Grocery Store, and then it says, Joe's Credit Union and Pharmacy and Bakery and different signs around it. And all of those could be backlit or whatever the zone allows, as long as the aggregate of all of those individual signs do not exceed the total signage that they're allowed.
And we clarified that in our last meeting, so that it was kind of a strange graph that went off the chart. We didn't know where it actually went.
And that was dealing, with a specific problem dealing with freestanding signs, where we don't have a theoretical end to how big a sign could be based on your frontage.
Do we need to clarify the sign ordinance itself before we tackle this issue of 8 seconds?
Well, can I weigh in there on that? So this is why I wanted to proceed through this with threshold questions, right? Right? Because first of all, the proposal from the committee is not necessarily to go to 8 seconds. So every time we throw out 8 seconds at this stage of the conversation, it's kind of a straw man, right? Because that's not necessarily an agreed upon proposal from the committee. But the issue that we've got from a legal perspective, I don't know if you caught this phrase, but it's a very common legal phrase in analyzing constitutionality of things, is if the regulation is narrowly tailored to serve the governmental interest, right? And so listening to Councillor Harding a minute ago, my reaction, thinking of it from the other side, and like what's a judge going to say is, well, I can think of this, and this other solution for what's worrying you, other than the hold time problem, right? You could put in spacing requirements that say you can't have them too close to each other, right? You could put in, anyway, I thought.
One electronic sign per property.
Per property, right?
And so they could only have one rather than 5 signs on a building, that each electronic with a second
Right.
turn.
I was assuming we had some kind of reasonable sign ordinance that would
Right.
control that.
Well, and so then let me back up and make this comment. I think the other fear here, I think the thing that both the committee and the council are struggling with is I think the committee, from my perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, committee members, I think the committee is struggling with, we've got 60 questions that we're struggling with, and we haven't figured out a way to get guidance from the council without having the council answer all 60 of them at the same time, right? And so we've talked about buffer zones, but there's no point in talking about buffer zones if 3 times a day is going to stay in the code, so we don't know whether to talk about them or not. We haven't talked about spacing between signs, but we could, but there's no point if 3 times a day is, right? So, but then we come to the committee and to the council, and we ask for the council to answer all these questions at the same time. And the council, I think, feels like, well, you're going to propose an ordinance to go to the planning commission next week that changes the hold time to 8 seconds. I don't, from my perspective, I don't think the committee wants to or even needs to do that. But they need to know the answer to the question of, should we get rid of the 3 times a day thing so we know what else to talk about, right? And so that's why if I was going to rephrase my threshold question, my first question for the council is, should the 3 times a day limitation be considered for revision if acceptable solutions can be found to other concerns? Or should we just stop talking about it? That's the threshold question, right?
I think, Brian, same question in a minute. Oftentimes at our committee meetings, I'm like, does the council even want electronic signs in our community? Where are we on that? Yeah, we want them. Okay, then if we want them, then we want the 3 times a day hold time.
If we're in the position of not wanting them at all, where do I go from there?
You go to Riverwoods, you go to the mall, you go to the county convention and talk with them, I
And
think,
then we say,
and see whether that's true.
gotta turn them on.
Whether it's true that I don't want them?
No, that the community doesn't want them. That's the problem we're facing.
Let me respond. Let me respond to that. I feel like, in a way, that ship has sailed. I think the council made a decision not long ago, was it a year ago, 8 months ago, a year ago, that we said, based on what I believe the argument was, an electronic sign that is not churning is no more obtrusive than a backlit sign. And by that, I've looked at it, I said, I agree with that. That makes sense to me. As long as that sign isn't changing, then there's really no difference between that and a backlit sign. I can't remember if this was just in my head or if this was talked about, but we talked about, like, gas stations have their signs up, and before electronic signs, they got out the big pole and with their little letters, and they changed the price of gas. And the price of gas might change, on a drastic day, maybe up to 3 times a day. And how often, would someone be out there changing those letters, or how conceivably would they add a new sign, sale 20% off or something on that? And I felt that once a day was reasonable, and let's be generous. Let's say 3 times a day. You can change it 3 times a day, and we still consider that a static sign equivalent to a backlit sign. And I felt good about that. And so the question, is, does the council even want electronic signs? My answer to that is, I thought we answered that, and my answer to that was yes, as long as they're no more obtrusive than a static backlit sign.
That didn't happen during my 4 years here. What's in your head didn't happen that I can remember.
Okay.
So it had to happen before I came over council.
Well, we came on together.
I think I recall that conversation. So we'll use the example of Dave's Market and how they'll go out and put up items that are on sale.
The council agreed that 3 times a day was reasonable.
For all the areas that previously
No churn.
Yeah, for all the areas that we previously said no electronic signs, we had corridors.
Right.
Yes, electronic signs are here. They're good. 8 seconds. For all those other areas,
that we said no electronic signs, we're now saying yes electronic signs. They can't change more than
Riverwood
3 times a day.
sign under our current ordinance can't turn more than 3 times a day, can't change.
It's grandfathered, is the only reason that it can. It's
Because
technically.
that sign isn't obtrusive to me, I don't
it's-
mind that sign.
Yeah, it's a grandfathered, non-conforming
That's what I'm
use.
basing my feeling on, their grandfather.
But a new sign, if they wanted to put up a new sign on the next, on their next corner, that one couldn't.
Okay. So, I really like 3 times a day because we don't really care how, when they change it, just as long as they don't change more than 3 times a day. Enforcement, it seems like usually it's a neighbor that says, oh, I can't stand this thing. And, for them to take a digital picture, and if they capture 4 pictures in a day that have different things, then they bring it into community development and say, see, they're abusing this. And
How come Riverwood's is grandfather?
Because they built their sign before we passed the ordinance.
Right, I thought that was about the answer, but I just wanted to be sure.
So I'm generally, because we opened it up to anywhere that they can have a backlit sign, they can have an electronic sign, I want to be very careful. I think under that premise, I think 3 times a day is reasonable and hopefully defensible by saying we opened ourselves up to this everywhere on the premise that it was similar to a static sign, and we feel that 3 times a day is equivalent to a static sign.
And if that's our justification, we probably ought to go back in for our own protection and pass a prohibition that you can't change your static sign more than 3 times a day.
Can I get another answer to my question?
Because we got to treat them the same,
It
right?
seems like to me that I didn't get a second, so 8 seconds isn't acceptable to anyone.
Say that again?
I didn't get a second to my motion, right?
No.
So 8 seconds isn't going to be acceptable to council. So I tried to settle that question, so that question's been settled.
Well,
I'll second. I'm struggling with something. As I drive down the street, is it really that obtrusive? The one that's obtrusive is the one that's on the phone. That's the hard one. That's the distraction. It's the phone, it's the texting, it's the drinking, it's the curling of the hair, it's the shaving. Those are the distractions.
You been following me down the street again?
Yeah, and Hannah could not find any evidence that said when a sign changes, there's more wrecks right there.
Yeah, but that's because of the difficulty of proving.
And I agree with
But
that.
that is not a reason, that is not a reason not to be cautious.
And I agree with that.
That's-
And I can deal with the cautiousness, and I can also say my son can't play football, my son can't play basketball because I want to be overly cautious. And that's up to me, and that's up to the council. But I'm looking at the community, and as I hear the things that we're doing, I look at our county convention center, and they're struggling. There are times that they need more advertising, and right now, this time of season is one of those, when you see the banner hanging on the wall. To me, that's tacky. And we have a beautiful convention center, and I'd like to see some kind of professional sign that can change more regularly.
Gary, that's still only 2 of us. We've got 1, 2, let's see if
Okay,
there's anyone else.
and I look at the mall.
High Turn area, it's in downtown High Turn.
It's not, and I look at the mall, I look at the mix, I look at where Walmart is, I look at the Riverwoods, and I'm starting to wonder, our community is so worried about raising the taxes 25 cents a month. We don't dare have truth in taxation issues because we don't want to raise it 25 cents a month, and yet we're getting a lot of these communities that, well, I can't build a sign. I have one lady that called me on 4th, I think it was the 3rd or 4th, Gary, that she says, I've got a business and I wanted to put a little sign out. Out by the Thai restaurant. And she says, they took my sign away and my business went down 40%. That was what she said. Now, and she shouldn't have put the sign on, not on her own property anyway, but I think that as we get communities, businesses that come in and say, we need people, we want to be here, and they don't talk about signs really to begin with, but if you get the communities around us that say, you know what Provo does for your advertising, don't you? They don't let you. So that all of a sudden, that could weigh more on getting those businesses here. Now, that's my opinion, so.
Signs are important, Gary. They don't do it so much today, but I remember at night, somebody would be throwing a party, a sale, and they'd get out the aircraft searchlights. And you'd be going, oh, wow, what is going on, you know? And it just, like moths to the light, people would go and try to figure out what's going on over there. And so signs can be very beneficial. I did ask, and I'm glad we found some answers on lawsuits. I mean, after what happened on North University Avenue, you really have to think, worst case, who's going to sue you? And you never know who it is going to be. And so you have to maybe look at it like, if I was a judge hearing this case, how would I view it? And so a judge might even say, I don't understand why you even differentiate between high churn and low churn. You know, why do you have high and low, and why do you have one so low and one so high? If it seems arbitrary, the judge is just going to throw it out. If it has some kind of reasonable basis, but that's where we don't seem to agree on what's, you know, reasonable, as in what's a nuisance, what is appropriate, and yes, brightness and size, but then the frequency of the churn seems to be a factor regardless of the brightness and the size.
And for the record, see a benefit, and I think if we start, there's consequences, there's outcomes for whatever we choose. So I think we need to recognize those things.
Mr. Sewell's been trying to speak for a while. Go ahead.
I'd like to share a few thoughts and some perspective from research I've done. It is true that in Utah, the 8-second hold time is much more common, but there are examples of cities in other places that have longer hold times, so I'll mention a few here. But before I get into that, I'd like to address what I think is the reason for the 8-second hold time. So we're talking about freeway speeds, and let me back up. One other thing we found looking at cases, Mr. Jones found this and I found this as well. Some of the laws that are struck down were struck down because the ordinance itself didn't have the rationale. You know, why was it set for this amount? And I think that's very important for us, whatever we decide, to have something that we've agreed on and that is actually written into the ordinance that describes what our reasoning was. So anyway, getting back to the 8 seconds. So I think, for me, the purpose of that is so that as you're driving down at 65 or 70 miles an hour, you're going to see at most one transition. I think I haven't been able to find the rationale in the document yet, but I think there's a safety concern if you're starting to read it and it changes, and you're starting to read the next one, and then that changes again. You know, the multiple transitions, I think, is very distracting and could draw your attention away from the road for an extended period of time. So for me, that's where the 8 seconds come from. Now, if you translate that into a city, though, you have to take speed into account. So, for example, on downtown with a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit, if you only want to see one transition at most, then that really should be at least 4 times that amount, like 35 seconds or something like that. Otherwise, at that low speed, you could see multiple transitions and have your eyes drawn away multiple times from the road.
Can I ask you a question about that concept, though? But you're going at a slower speed, so you have greater reaction time, so it's not as dangerous as doing it on the freeway. So
potentially, but if you hit a pedestrian, I mean, it's, you know, I mean.
Also,
yeah,
any instant.
Yeah.
Freeways, it's less likely that someone's going to try to back out because they can't see.
So I actually found an example of several cities. I'm not proposing that we do this, that scale the time depending on the speed limit. So it might be 10 or 12 seconds depending on the speed limit on the road. I think that's overly complicated personally.
But the other thing I think that we need to take into account is in the highway setting, I think generally, most of the time, not all the time, you're dealing with one sign at a time. You know, they're typically mostly all on the right side of the road, and you typically encounter them one at a time. I think in a city environment, as has been mentioned, you need to deal with the possibility that you could see 3 businesses on your right and 3 businesses on your left. And as electronic signs get cheaper and more pervasive, they might all have electronic signs that are changing. Even if you limit it to 1 per building, you still might see half a dozen or more in your field of view. So I think that's another difference between on-premise regulation and billboard highway regulations we need to take into account. So, some cities have gone with longer hold times. Here's just a few examples. And there are still cities that do ban them outright. I should probably mention that first. There's a case in Concord, New Hampshire, 2009, where the First Circuit Court upheld a complete ban on on-premise digital signs on the grounds of safety and community aesthetics. And presumably they had some rationale for that, but although I wasn't able to dig into the detail on that. Urbana, Illinois has a 3-minute hold time. East Point, Georgia has a 6-minute hold time. Bloomington, Minnesota has a 20-minute hold time. I found one city that had an hour minimum hold time, but that was a while back and I neglected to write it down. So there are some examples out there. It's not as common, but there's also, I think, a growing body of research that does, I think, give us reason to be cautious about the safety implications. There was a study in Sweden. I'll just read a couple of sentences from that. A study was done there. The visual behavior data showed that drivers had a significantly longer dwell time, a greater number of fixations, and longer maximum fixation duration when driving past an electronic billboard compared to other signs on the same road stretches. No differences were found for day and night. Anyway, in Sweden, they actually, the whole country bans digital billboards because of these concerns, which is a little bit of an outlier there. So I think it's important, whatever we decide, that we have a rationale for it. And in my mind, the original rationale for the 3 times a day was to preserve the static feel so you wouldn't really notice the signs changing. I do recommend that we lower that. If we wanted to keep with that same feel that you basically hardly ever saw something changing, I would recommend something like an hour. I think that has problems, but that would basically preserve the feel that whether you're driving, bicycling, or walking through the area, you would rarely see any sign change. I think that might be a little difficult to defend.
And enforce.
But at least enforceability-wise, I think an hour is at least somewhat reasonable. You can tape it for an hour, have an enforcement officer there for an hour. It's still kind of difficult.
It's usually an hour or a half hour. Half hour would make enforcement easier.
Yeah.
Or 15 minutes.
Or something like that. So if the idea is, again, if we're taking cyclists and pedestrians into account, and we want to minimize the chance that they're going to see a change, then something in that range between 20 minutes, half hour, hour, so something along that line. The problems I see with that, so I personally favor lowering it to a minute, and the reason I do is because I think an argument that's going to be made if we get sued is, well, if you're trying to tailor the ordinance to pedestrians and cyclists so that they won't see a change either, you're tailoring it to address the needs of just 2% of my potential customers. You're slowing it down to the point to accommodate the pedestrians and the cyclists,
unnecessarily, and 90% of the people that might see my ads are going to be driving by. So if we're focusing more on the motorists, then I think the minute is pretty reasonable, because you're rarely going to see a change as you're driving by. And we actually have an example of that on North University Avenue. I find as I drive by that sign that changes once a minute, I rarely notice it change. If I'm walking by, I do see it change. But so I think, we'd have to decide what's our goal there. If our goal is to have hardly anybody see it, then we go with the longer, the 15 or the half hour or the hour, whatever. If our goal is only to make it so that motorists would rarely see a transition, then I think a minute is sufficient. One more thing. The other thing that to me is a little problematic going over a minute is we can't limit content on the site. So somebody could put, I mentioned a time and temperature display, or they could put a breaking news display, or they could put latest stock market information. And those kind of things get kind of difficult, I think, if you've got like a 20-minute or a half-hour roll time, whereas I have not been able to think of an application where the ability to change once a minute would not be sufficient.
So if I were the judge, you would win the case. I really appreciate the thought you put into your presentation. And when I read the 1-minute recommendation citywide, it seemed reasonable to me. The only thing that I had a question about is, what do we do with the billboards on the freeway down by the mall? So real billboards along the freeway that are still within the city would be exempt, or?
Are we even contemplating changes to the billboard? We're just focusing on
on-premises signs. Yeah.
And we couldn't.
Okay, but is the mall a billboard or on-premise?
That's an on-premise.
But they would be grandfathered.
They'd be grandfathered and they're in a high churn. So are we talking about increasing the hold time from 8 seconds to 1 minute for the high churn corridors as well?
That is one of the proposals, yes.
just fun. The reason I would recommend that is, well, for two reasons. For just the general safety and aesthetics, I personally think the longest hold time that we can support and defend and get on is better. Because as you pointed out, the longer the better. The longer the better, because the more digital signs proliferate, eventually we will get to that point where you're walking down the street or driving down the street and you might see a license in your field of view, and even changing once a minute, you're gonna see some change there. So.
But you could support once a minute.
Yes, I could support once a minute, and the reason I like making it uniform throughout the city for two reasons. Well, it's easier for enforcement, for one, and then the other reason is I think if we have the two different zones, it weakens our argument, because we can go to a lot of trouble to put our reasons into the code, our reasons for aesthetics, our reasons for safety. We can cite studies and all that, why we think it should be 1 minute in the low turn zones. But then if we have this other zone where we allow it to change every 8 seconds, we could be subject to attack. Well, so why is it not safe? Why is it unsafe to have it that short here, but you're not worried about it over here? You see what I mean?
I agree with you. Whatever we do, it should be citywide.
Yeah.
As I go forward, I would like 1 minute. I think we're sending the wrong messages to the businesses and the communities that we're trying to attract also. And I think 1 minute is, personally, I think it's a little long when I start looking at all the, for example, where Maggleby's Fresh is, just north of our infamous sign, just north of that, there's 15 businesses. All feel like they need to advertise. 1 minute, you're not going to get. So I would really like to see some of those have the opportunity to advertise.
1 minute is certainly different than 3 times a day.
Oh, no question. And I think that's one thing that we wanted to bring, that Brian brought up, is that we want to bring Is 3 times a day acceptable in the community now? Or have we changed to the point that I'll vote for 1 minute if it's versus 3 times a day? But I almost think even 30 seconds just to get it, I am concerned about our message that we're sending to the businesses.
All right, so, let's see, okay. Kind of as Mr. Hanley was saying earlier about, like what's the point? If how can we say that it's not distracting if the whole purpose of the sign is to attract attention? I feel like this whole time, and honestly, I've never really understood billboards on freeways changing every 8 seconds. I've never been a freeway commuter, but I imagine that if I was driving past a digital billboard that changed once a day, I would be getting a different message every day. I can't tell you how many times when I am on the freeway, and again, it's not daily, but I'll see something about, oh, that's interesting, because again, they're designed to catch your attention. I'll look at it, and I start to read it, and then it changes. And then I pass it. And so I had zero value from either of the messages that were displayed while I was there, where if there had been a static one, I would have caught that. So if we're talking about, well, let's bump this up to 34 seconds or whatever, because it's a multiple of the speed, and that way you rarely see it turn. Well, if you rarely see it turn, doesn't that defeat the whole purpose of having it turn so you can, instead of having, signs of this size, you have a sign that's a lot bigger, that it rotates through it. But if the average person driving by only sees one as they drive by, what's the point of that?
Because each time they drive by, they'll see a different one.
Right, but if that's the case, then isn't once a day sufficient? Isn't once an hour sufficient?
I think it's like the cumulative effect and maybe the advertising potential of like a digital sign operator.
Yeah,
It was also that case where there was the strip mall and they had 15 businesses or so that
Right.
Brian mentioned. And they could all be advertised on their monument sign about yay big.
Right, that's what I was just
But if they
saying.
could turn over once a minute, then.
But if someone drives by once a day,
But these
one
are,
driver,
these are
yes,
also
but they're going to
businesses that are
expose
right
thousands
off
of
the side of the road, and they
Right.
already have signs on their businesses. I mean, I know where Maggleby's is because it says it on the store.
Yeah.
I just don't understand why I just feel like we're proliferating light everywhere and this is the only way that we can think to be competitive. I mean, I don't think anybody needs the temperature reading on a sign. We all have phones and cars that tell us what the temperature is. I don't think we need stock market readings. I just think this is.
Do you see those now? I don't see those anymore.
Well, there's tons of temperature and clocks.
Are there? I don't.
that's all.
Yeah, they're all over.
Some of those signs we're able to do with it.
I don't know.
They
I
were
just
installed.
feel like we're going in there. I mean, I know I'm an outlier, but I feel like we're going the wrong.
One thing you're missing something, and that's the fact that when I'm parked at 4800 North and University Avenue and looking at the Riverwood sign, I'm seeing 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, which is helpful.
At the stoplight. Yes.
You're talking when they're driving, what about when you're
Yeah, that's
stopping?
true.
You stop all the time. Stoplights.
And that's why I do want to push back just really quickly, or at least let you know that I do see value in having corridors with higher, and I think maybe if it's not a safety issue, I think it's an aesthetic issue. So I would like to discuss that more before we drop it. Talked about, are we gearing it to pedestrians and bikers, but we also have diners, we also have shoppers, we have people, that are these businesses' customers that are there, and again, kind of the cumulative changing. I'm open to looking at and saying, and looking at buffer zones and looking at treating certain signs differently than wall-mounted signs and whatnot, because kind of that dystopian picture I have in my head that scares me to death, maybe we can make sure that doesn't happen and we can still achieve some of the goals. I'm willing to have that. But the biggest thing is, and I feel it on a lot of the projects I'm pushing forward, but the end is near for this council. Before we make any changes.
I'm glad you at least said for this council.
The end is near.
You're gonna get rid of Bryce going, and then you got the council going.
This council will soon be passing. So
But the changes we're talking about are fairly significant. It affects the character of our community, and I think are hard to pull back once they're done. And so whatever we do, I hope we come up with our best proposal, and then we throw it out to the community through Open City Hall. We give them a good chance to weigh in on before we actually make any changes.
Can I piggyback on that? So what I would actually like to see is perhaps several options on University, or on Open City Hall. Unless we really come together with one that we want to propose. And for each one of them, we would have that page or that paragraph that we're going to put in the code as right up there with it. So this is why we think this is a possible good option. You know, this is our statement. If we go with this option, this is why we think we might be able to support this. Then the community could kind of weigh in and help us decide which of those options is the best balance. And then when we do end up selecting one, we'll have some additional feedback from the community that we can incorporate as to why we made the decision.
I like that. So let's say you have 3 options, and you have 3 different pages that you can go on, and each page changes at a different rate.
One of them, it takes them 24 hours to take the survey.
They're actually
speed limit.
Sign churn, the width of the road, with different timelines that you can put up and link to, and people can see what a 30-second hold time is and what a minute, and just, it's like visual or virtually experiencing it.
And I think that there's something else that needs to be incorporated in this somehow, is the fact that if we, I don't want signs, but I know that there's outcomes from that. That businesses, would you be willing to have a 30-second, a minute hold time if we raised your property taxes 25 cents a month? Some of those things, I just think there's other, we might be losing sales tax.
We are losing.
And so I think as we talk about that, say, okay, everybody likes it. I like no sign. This is my billboard, no signs. Okay, if I lose that, am I willing to pay just a little bit more for that? There is an outcome for that.
There's also, we pay for it in other ways too, though.
We do.
This costs money, it costs the businesses money, it wastes energy, and.
But who's paying for it?
Well, but I'm just saying there are all kinds of costs that are in play here, and it's not just with businesses. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't want to live in towns with lots of.
And are they
bright
willing to
signs.
pay for that? That's my question.
I hope so.
So this mirrors on a larger scale the conversations that we've been having at the sign committee.
So it hasn't gotten any better.
Well, we do this at 7 in the morning, you guys. And we're done in a month.
So I guess one of the questions we have, because a lot of effort and time has gone into it, it sounds to me like we don't have a consensus on a number. It seems to me if you don't have a consensus on a number that...
I think you might be for the minute.
Well, voted. I mean, I know I'm an outlier here, and it may very well be the case. I'm not going to make a fit over the fact that I'm more conservative on this than others. So I mean, whatever.
So ultimately,
rest of the council.
where we are from staff is we're trying to help you get to a policy. Unless there's a number that you can get your heads around, then you kind of have a couple of choices. There's probably multiple choices, but 2 that I can think of. One is ask us to go out to the public, with a bit of some kind of survey or something, and bring that information back, or drop it. Right? Those are kind of two stark options. The other is unless you want to try and pass a motion that says we're going to go to this standard and then have us enact it. Really, you're kind of at a point. Either you move forward with a motion to do A or B or C or whatever, or we kind of kick the can down the road to the next council. decide if they even want to bring it up, raise the issue.
And that was my intent with the initial threshold question, right? One of the things I love about this council is that you desire so much to have consensus. But sometimes consensus is not possible, right? And sometimes you've got to make a policy decision about, will we only move forward if there is consensus, or will we move forward anyway, right? And I think my sense is that the committee has gotten to a point where if the majority of the council thinks that the 3 times a day standard should remain, then you should tell us that today, and the sign committee should be disbanded and told that they've fulfilled their mission, right? But if that's not if the majority of the council thinks it should change, regardless of whether there's agreement about what it should change to, then you should tell us that today so that the committee knows whether to keep working on this or not. And then we can move forward to the next question, which is, again, it's a series of questions in step, right? If you answer that question, then and only then do we move to the next one, and there's a variety of ways to address the next one.
I can make a motion.
Let me take the first step.
They're going to miss you, George.
George is running out of time to make motions.
So my preference, just how you just laid that out, my preference would be to embrace the 3 changes per day for areas outside of what we've designated as high churn, and put whatever rationale we need in, maybe say static signs can't change more than 3 times a minute, whatever we need to do to bolster that. And then carefully come back and say, okay, surgically say, okay, what areas do we feel that this 3 times a day is insufficient? And what do we do with buffers, and is it how can is it only 1 sign per business can be churning, and the others aren't? Let's just carefully step into that with public feedback and all of that. That would be my preferences.
Pretty long motion.
That was the proposed course of action, not
If I could just clarify, are you? What I got from that is that you're contemplating that we might end up with 3 areas instead of 2. That we would have low churn, high churn, and something in between in designated, carefully selected areas?
No, but it would be more of if we. So we have the high churn, which I'm okay with. We have low churn generally. Now, if we're looking at decreasing the hold time, increasing the churn rate, do we, what buffers could be put in place? What restrictions on that high churn so we don't have multiple signs per business after business, all churning at 8 seconds? So just kind of rather than just putting a blanket across the whole city, reinforce what we have, and then look at how we might make small changes from that and ease into any changes to address the specific concerns.
And I appreciate that. One of the concerns we had was enforcement and sending out all our officers. Where am I? What zone am I in? That became a challenge for Gary, from what I understand.
Well, yeah, the simpler something is, the easier it is to enforce. Having said that, what is probably the most important is to have clear, defined ordinances that we can enforce. So would one area in the entire city be easier for us? Yes. Could we do 2? Yes. Is it harder than 1? Yes, because we've got to remember and we've got to train people. Is 3 harder than 2? Yes. Is 4? So every step you take, it doesn't mean we can't do it. It just means we're more prone to make a mistake, the more complicated
And to not do it.
The what?
And to not do it, quite frankly.
And yes, and to think and not do enforcement because we think something's okay. Oh, and then the longer the hold times, realistically, if it's 3 times a day, am I going to go have a code enforcement officer stake out a sign literally for 24 hours? No. I'm just not going to do that. We don't have enough people and time and money to do that. And so that type of enforcement, frankly, it would be complaint-driven, and we would be probably relying on the complainant to come in and testify that, hey, I was here, I know, and be able to give that testimony in court. And if they were not willing to do it, we wouldn't enforce.
So anything we would pass would, obviously, everything that's existing right now is grandfathered. So if we, for the sake of argument, if we said, we're going to do a citywide 1 hour hold time for everybody, Riverwoods would still be changing 7 times during the stop sign or whatever, stoplight or whatever, right? Everything else continues as is, but we...
Until our sign breaks.
Well,
Everything that's legal now,
yeah,
right?
there's a little bit of a nuance to that because of how we divided it between. It used to all be in Title 14. So your example of the Riverwoods would be grandfathered because they put their sign in before we had any sign regulations whatsoever. Okay, so they would be grandfathered. If you had somebody who put their sign up after the low churn area was, well, I guess that's not going to matter anyway because 1 hour is less than 3 times a day. So yes, the short answer is if you can do it 8 seconds now legally, you could still do it 8 seconds after we moved it to an hour. Does that make sense?
But an illegal sign that's just sending words across right now and it's not allowed,
Right.
wouldn't suddenly be grandfathered by doing the 1 hour.
Right.
So, question.
We're going to wrap this up, and we're already 10 minutes over. We're going to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes. And, okay.
So I got a question, Dave Sewell. How many communities out there actually have a high and low churn area at all? Don't they just have one standard mostly?
I haven't run across that. I wasn't specifically looking for it, though. I don't
In
know.
the cities that we looked at, the other like more local comparable cities, none of them had separate hold times. It was all citywide.
Yeah, so.
But do they allow signs everywhere like we do? Do we know that?
It
Or these
was
billboards?
different. Some had, like, they couldn't be within 500 feet of each other, for example, or a certain distance. Some had prohibited areas like residential zones.
So I would like to hear a motion, George.
Oh, I thought you wanted my motion.
Sorry.
You can go ahead and make it because you know what
Okay.
you want to say.
So I would move that we have one area for the whole city and it'd be 1 minute change time, hold time, and see if we have 4 votes for that.
So this motion is to direct the committee to move forward with that.
Give them some direction, yeah.
Okay. Is there a second to that? Is that a second or a comment?
That's a second.
Second by David Sewell. Okay, any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I will call for a vote. All in favor?
Guess that answers that.
Yeah.
Any post-vote discussion in the 4 minutes we have left?
Can I ask a question of the administration that you might want to sidestep?
From your perspective, what is the longest citywide hold time that feels reasonable, that feels like something you could get behind and enforce it and feel good about it? Do you want to tackle that or not?
I think it's an enforcement question predominantly. I think a minute. I think a minute, and the rationale and justification for that, I think makes sense. It's logical, we can put it on the record. It's not arbitrary, it's considered. Now, if you're going to allow electronic signs everywhere, I think, which the council already has, I think a minute is the most defensible, is the least amount of time that is defensible.
The longest amount of time.
What?
The longest amount of time.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I said that backwards. The longest amount of time that would be.
So 8 seconds versus 1 minute, you prefer a minute?
You prefer a minute?
Well, if you're talking about the likely, if we had 8 seconds and we were sued over that, I have no question or hesitation we would win. If we were sued at a minute, because our hold time's a minute, I'm very confident we would win. From a minute, once you start getting over a minute, and just seeing the cases that I've seen up there, and Brian and I have talked about some, we've talked about some in the committee, just other research I've looked at and things, my confidence in winning starts going down once you get past a minute.
Okay.
Why don't you make a motion again? I'm gonna do it for a minute.
You can make a motion.
Better than what we have now.
Well, and I'm wondering if I'm wondering if the vote on the motion was because some people wanted less than a minute, so.
Yes.
Maybe if the motion had been a minute or less.
Okay,
And consider
well,
the options.
a minute or less in citywide versus a minute or more, as you just pointed out, it changes dramatically potentially at the minute mark.
And all of this will be going through the committee and going out to the public before we.
And through planning
commission.
commission.
And through planning.
So I just thought, why don't you just do a straw poll and see which of you wants a minute, which wants, which of you support a minute, which would you support 88 seconds, and kind of see where you lie.
Minute or less, citywide.
I almost wondered, so Brian, you had like a yes or no question, that might
Yeah.
be even better to get, because I feel like there's disagreement too, because I think some of the motion was, like, people didn't vote for it because they want longer than a minute or shorter than a minute.
But I think-
So his question, I feel like.
Go make the motion in a minute or less, let's roll. That would give
A
you.
minute or less. I'll
I hear a motion.
That would answer your
Because I
original
think,
question.
yeah, I think the idea is,
Frame the motion.
so yeah, I'll frame it and you tell me if this, so what I'm hearing some people suggest is if there was a motion that the question go back to the committee to consider and evaluate a citywide hold time of a minute or less and bring to the council proposals of how that would actually be implemented and work.
That's my motion.
It's a good motion, George.
Okay, motion made. Mr. Stewart, any seconds? Seconded by Mr. Connect. All in favor? And those opposed? So, in favor, well, in favor is everyone except for Councilor Henley and myself.
I'm going to Sweden.
Been there, done that. This is better.
All right. And there has not been a request for closed session, so unless there's an objection, we will now adjourn by unanimous consent.
Without the tag team.
Yeah, exactly.